All right.
Hold up.
And then after yours, we'll have Lucerna with his opening statement. Then we'll have first rebuttals and second rebuttals, each 8 minutes. And then we'll have 8-minute cross exams, and then we'll have 3-minute conclusions.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Timer up real quick. All right. 15 minutes. All right, Abdulaziz, go ahead and start.
In this debate, we're going to go over one of the most common claims that the Christians make, that it was unanimously agreed upon that Christ was killed by the way of crucifix under Pontius Pilate in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, and so on and so forth, until our prophet Muhammad ﷺ came. This killing of Christ, the Christians would claim, would be done by the Jews or the Romans, depending on if you read Paul's writings or the Gospels. They also like to claim that Muhammad ﷺ was an innovator for saying that Jesus wasn't killed, and I will refute them on this. And we will show that this belief is founded in the 1st century with the Hawariyun. Right? Christians heavily rely on the event of the crucifix to have their faith and their soteriology, their doctrine of salvation, which Paul derives from the crucifix. As Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who is hung on the pole." Right? The Quran frees Jesus from the Paul's slander, like it does to all the rest of the prophets that are slandered in the Bible. Right? In Surah Al-Maryam, chapter 19, verse 30 to 31, where it says, "Jesus declared, I'm truly servant of Allah. He has destined me to be given the scripture and to be a prophet. He has made me a blessing, not a curse. He has made me a blessing wherever I go, and bid me to establish prayer and give zakat as long as I live." Right? Paul, to see like how important the crucifixion is in regards to Christianity, right? Paul also states in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 and verse 4, and in verse 14, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. He was buried and he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day, just as the scripture said," even though, funnily enough, he doesn't cite any scriptures, right? Then he says in verse 14, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." Right? So we see that this is a central core belief to Christianity and their doctrine, and we see that Jesus being killed on the cross is what Paul, the first one to ever profess, he's the first one to ever profess that Jesus was crucified, makes it the heart of his writings. Right? This debate is going to be about the historicity of the crucifix and the early attestation of what actually happened to Jesus, and we'll view this from a theological perspective while looking at the scripture, i.e. doing an internal critique, and we will also see the attestation external to the New Testament and if it's in line with the events of the New Testament. I will show the truthfulness in the Quranic narrative and ruin the Christian position while making the arguments as follows. First, I'm going to start off with, and I know he's probably going to bring up this historical attestation, these people writing around the 1st and 2nd century, right? But I'm going to make the claim that there's 0 non-Christian witnesses to the crucifixion in form of attestation to the events in the 1st century and early 2nd century from historians and writers contemporary to that time. He will likely bring up Cornelius Tacitus, Flavius Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Mara Barsaripion, Thales, Lucian, Celsus, and rabbinic sources to prove that Jesus was killed, and I will deal with these with ease. Okay, let's start with the Testimony of Flavinium. Leading experts on Flavius Josephus mention the overwhelming majority of modern scholarship question this passage's authenticity, the Testimony of Flavinium. This is a book, New Perspective on Jewish-Christian Relations. Here they quote the scholar Louis H. Feldman, who says, "In my Josephus and my modern scholarship, 1937 to 1980, I mentioned 87 articles discussing this passage for the period 1937 to 1980, the overwhelming majority of which question these paragraphs' authenticity in whole or in part. The first person to ever mention this is Eusebius from the 4th century. There were 8 Christian writers before Eusebius who referenced from Josephus without mentioning the Testimonium. And in fact, Origen cited 5 passages from this chapter without mentioning this passage. So we have a bunch of church fathers who are mentioning Josephus' works, but they're not mentioning the Testimonium Flavinium that talks about Jesus being the Messiah, that talks about him being a wise man, that talks about him being killed under Pontius Pilate. Right, right here, I'm going to continue reading. Even after Eusebius, 4 Christian writers referenced from passages from Josephus, but none of them mention Flavinium Testimonium, crucifixion passage. Moreover, the extant manuscripts come not before the 11th century, and it's an academic consensus that Eusebius had some interpolations added into these scriptures, and most of the modern day scholars regard it as not useless. Useless right here. Dr. Jonathan McClatchy says, he's a popular Christian apologist, says, "Yes, I agree that the sources such as the Testimony of Flavinium are almost useless in terms of evidential value. However, Josephus and other ancient sources are useful in other ways," and he has an article where he cites this. Okay, to conclude with Josephus, right? Jesus was mentioned in Josephus, and this is from the book The Historical Figure of Jesus by E.P. Sanders. This is page number 50. Jesus was mentioned in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus, as we saw above, was born in 37 CE, just a few years after Jesus' death, and he wrote the Antiquities in the 90s. The Jewish historians certainly knew something about Jesus, and there is a paragraph about him in that Antiquities, but Josephus' works were preserved by Christian scribes who could not resist the temptation to revise the text and thus make Josephus proclaim that Jesus was the Messiah, that he taught the truth, and that after Jesus' death, he was restored to life. Failing a fluke discovery, we shall never know what Josephus actually wrote. Okay, and this is in E.P. Sanders, the historical figure of Jesus, and page number 50. Next, Tacitus. Okay, firstly, Tacitus is merely defining what Christians in his times believed. He was no independent historian, right here. But knowledge, this is from the same book, Historical Figure of Jesus, E.P. Sanders, where he says, but knowledge of Jesus was limited to knowledge of Christianity. That is, and the Jesus adherents had not started a movement that spread to Rome, Jesus would not have made it into Roman histories at all. The consequence is that we do not have what we would very much like, a comma in Tacitus or another Gentile writer that offers independent evidence about Jesus, his life, and his death. And this is, okay, this is another book, Jesus Outside the New Testament, by Robert E. Van Vroest. The most likely source of Tacitus's information about Christ is Tacitus's own dealings with Christians, directly or indirectly, right? And secondly, Tacitus didn't even mention the crucifixion. He didn't even mention Jesus dying by way of crucifixion. All he did was mock the Christians for worshiping a God who got the ultimate punishment. And scholars mention that this ultimate punishment can be interpreted in many different ways. This is Gunnar Samuelson and his Crucifixion and Antiquity, second edition. Here is page 166. Nothing in the text suggests that Tacitus connects the punishment, supplicio, of Jesus with the attaching crucis, crucibis ad fixi of the Christians. The problem is, however, that Tacitus does not offer any negative or strengthening attribute to the noun in the quoted text above. It is just referred to as a punishment. On the other hand, when he describes the punishment of the Jews under Quadratus and mentions a capital punishment, he uses a different and stronger terminology, capite poenas, the label ultimate punishment. Right at the end of the text appears to cover not only the attachment to crucis, but also the fate of being killed by dogs, as well as being burnt in Nero's garden. So he says there's a multiple ways of scholars can understand like this ultimate punishment that Tacitus, Cornelius Tacitus, is writing about Jesus and what happened to Jesus. All right, and then thirdly, the extant manuscripts of Tacitus comes from the 9th and the 11th century and a whole nother language. Right here, I'm reading from the book, the New Testament Documents, F. Bruce, where of the 14 books of the histories of Tacitus, only 4.5 survive. Of the 16 books of his annals, 10 survive in full and 2 in part. The text of these extant portions of his 2 great historical works depends entirely on 2 manuscripts, one of the 9th century and one of the 11th. So these are writings that are coming much, much later when it comes to his extant manuscripts. I know he's probably going to bring Pliny the Younger, Sotenius, Martyr Beresopion, Thales, Lucian, Celsus, rabbinic sources as well. Mike Lacona admits that all of these sources are not useful to prove Jesus' crucifixion. In his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, and he's a Christian apologist as well. He's an evangelical Christian. He propagates the view that Jesus was crucified, and he makes like a really silly arguments to prove it, but right here he tells us that none of these sources are reliable. This is in his pages 244, 245, 246, where he mentions that every single one of the sources right here, and we can go into them because there's a lot of reading, but every single one of these sources that I just mentioned prior, he assigns it a rating of not useful, not useful, not useful, not useful, not useful, not useful, not useful. Okay, now next we're going to get into the Gospels, right? Next, I'll attack the Gospels accounts, which is his primary objective source. It should be his primary objective source. He's a Catholic. He should hold to biblical inerrancy, just like Irenaeus, just like Athanasius, just like Augustine of Hippo, just like John of Chrysostom. They all held to biblical inerrancy. And we're going to see this whole claim of biblical inerrancy and how it completely flunks on him, right? Next, which is, okay. The sources from the Gospels are horrendously unreliable and do nothing to help prove the historical event of the crucifix and just muddy the waters. I'll show that they contain many historical inaccuracies that have no sort of corroboration. One example is Matthew chapter 27, verse 51 through 53, when it talks about the saints resurrecting from when the temple splits in two, and the saints resurrect from their graves and they start roaming the city of Jerusalem, which scholars like William Lane Craig, he says probably only a very few conservative scholars would treat the story as historical. And well, in his book, Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up, in page 164 and 165. Mike Lacona as well, he says this is a strange report, this is special effects, in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, page 530 and page 552. And Mark mentions every single detail of this event, but Matthew doesn't mention it. In Mark chapter 15, verse 36 to 38, Matthew mentions this event in Matthew chapter 27, verse 48 and 4 through 52, even though we know, like Markan priority, two-source hypothesis, that Mark would have been the backbone of the synoptic gospels, right? And Mike Lacona also admits that in the gospel passion narratives, it is often difficult to determine where history ends and legend begins. And Paul doesn't even mention this event when Paul is preaching to the Gentiles, and he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 12, but if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? So Paul doesn't even mention the saints resurrecting when he's trying to prove that there's resurrection in the afterlife. Josephus doesn't mention it as well, and I would make the argument that a lot of scholars make that it was likely taken, this story was probably taken from a pagan holiday called Anethesteria, okay? As we can see, the passion narratives have included legends and pagan stories. And to conclude, as everyone knows, the scholarly consensus in regards to the Gospels is that they are anonymous, since the authors don't identify themselves, and untrustworthy pertaining to the life, ministry, and events that took place in Christ's life. Right here, I'm reading from the book, The Good News According to Mark. We do not know who the author is. conceivable that Mark was even his real name. The superscriptions of the biblical books were not added until the 2nd century, but it was necessary, at least orally, to distinguish between the Gospels as soon as there was more than one. And he says the real author is not known, and they make the arguments that he doesn't even know the geography of Palestine, right? So like attributed to him is very weak. Let's continue with ruining Matthew, or ruining the tradition apostolic succession, going through the writings of John. Right here, the Bible Dictionary by Paul J. Achtheimer. Right here, he says the question of the identity of the author is not satisfactorily resolved by the tradition that identifies him with John, the son of Zebedee. If 2nd John and 3rd John are his work, it is curious that he refers to himself as only an elder and not as an apostle. And 1st John remains anonymous, right? And then Matthew, reliability and the authorship ruining it, is right here, the New Testament story by Ben Witherington, where he says the gospel is a composite of several known sources, including 95% of Mark. Right, so he's saying like 95% of the content that's in Mark is in Matthew. A wide range of Q material and some material unique to Matthew called special M, such as what we find in the birth narratives. It may be appropriately be asked why one of the original 12 of the disciples, who was an eyewitness of the life of Jesus, would so profoundly be dependent on a gospel written by a non-eyewitness, namely Mark. Right, and since Matthew's gospel is so clearly dependent on Mark, it must then have been written later than Mark's gospel, perhaps sometimes in the 70s or 80s. This gospel is, however, different in numerous ways from Mark's gospel, although it fits a description of being in an ancient biography, right? Papias is the first one to mention. Now we can see like who is quoting which scripture and saying what is authoritative. Papias is the first to mention Mark, Matthew, but many scholars like Bartram and Bruce Metzger and Charles H. Wright disregard his works heavily in pointing out flaws, right? And they talk about Papias they talk about him completely contradicting the narrative of how Judas died. And in any event, this is from Bartram's book, Jesus Interrupted. In any event, Papias does not seem to provide, this is page 109, in any event, Papias does not seem to provide with the kind of information we can place a lot of confidence in. I should point out in this connection that scholars have almost uniformly rejected just about everything that Papias is recorded to have said in the surviving references to his work. And it's Eusebius, 200 years later, is the one who's quoting Papias about the Gospels of Mark and Matthew being identified, named, and deemed as authentic scripture. So we have nothing from Papias, his works himself, or anything that's reliable. Scholars also bring up examples why Papias is unreliable. Right here, fragments of Papias, a hero of St. John, are preserved in the writings of Irenaeus and Eusebius. Papias is most unreliable. The saying of the Lord found in Papias about the true fertility of the future fertility of the earth is apocryphal and is found in the Apocalypse of Baruch, which is probably the 1st century after Christ. And in that book is in such a manner as to prove that the idea is far earlier. See Professor Charles, Apocalypse of Baruch, page 54-55. Papias' account of the death of Judas contradicts that in the gospel that is mentioned in the Gospels and Acts. This is by Charles H. Wright from his book Apostolic Fathers. Right, and this is another inconsistency. We see that Papias' account for Judas' death differs. I got you. Another inconsistency we see. Papias' account for Judas' death differs from that of Acts and the Gospel of Matthew. According to Papias, Judas suffered a gruesome physical decay as divine punishment for his betrayal of Jesus. Papias then describes Judas as becoming bloated to the extent that he could not pass through areas that even a chariot could. His body swelled up severely, that his eyes became swollen shut, and his skin ruptured, releasing pus and worms. And Papias claims that Judas' death occurred on his own land. This death account, as acknowledged by scholars, completely differs from that which we see in Acts, where he fell headfirst and burst open, and then Matthew chapter 27 verse 5-8, where he hanged himself. What did he do with the money? Right, returned it to the priest or kept it for himself? There's many inconsistencies, many contradictions in these narratives pertaining to a very key figure, Judas of Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus. So we see the early church fathers and the gospel writers and the author of Acts completely differ on the account of the one who betrayed Christ, his life and death, who was an important figure of the Christian story, therefore weakening the trust and reliability placed on them. We don't know what Papias is reading. We don't know where and from who these writers are getting their information. And when it comes to the Gospels, Matthew and Luke depend on Mark by consensus, and this is known as the synoptic problem, Mark in priority. And from the 1st and 2nd century, the only scriptures that we have as fragments and conservative datings from John is 100 CE, while many scholars, especially European, will say later. And Mark is earlier around, but Mark isn't a first-hand eyewitness of the crucifixion, and Matthew and Luke depend on Mark and are not eyewitnesses themselves, so they are not corroborating anything. And Eusebius is the first one to mention that Mark is an interpreter of Peter and isn't a first-hand account to Jesus' life and ministry, and he mentions this in Ecclesiastical History, chapter 3, 39, right? What else could we go over? The Irenaeus would be the first one to authenticate these Gospels and quote them for by name, but right here, this is from Alexander Roberts. The great work of Irenaeus is unfortunately no longer extant in the original, has come down to us only in the ancient Latin version, with the exception of the greater part of the first book, which has been preserved in the original Greek, though means of copious quotations by Hippolytus and Epiphanius. The text, both Latin and Greek, is often most uncertain, the Latin version being itself of the barbarous character, right? Next, I will show, and I can do this in my next statement because I'm running out of time. Next, I will show that there were people in Paul's time heavily rejecting the crucifixion and the soteriology that Paul was deriving from the supposed crucifix. crucifix. Jewish Christians as well, arguing against Ignatius. I'll go into that, right? And then we'll go over what the Quran claims in regards to Surah Nisa, chapter 4, verse 155 through 158, what it tells us about the Christians, what it tells us about the ikhtilaf that they had, the shak, the doubt that they had. They were speaking with no ilm, they weren't getting their knowledge from reliable sources, and that they ended up following conjecture or hearsay, dhan, right?
30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds, okay. We're going to be going over all of the attestation within the first century of the crucifix, those who were silent on it, those who downplayed it, those who undermined it, and those who outright rejected it, showing that the foundation that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is teaching in regards to Jesus not being crucified was well within the first century, well within the second century, with all these different groups claiming all these different things. And we're going to prove that it's certainly not a historical fact that Jesus was crucified. Okay, and I'll continue on in my next
Time. All right. Zach 11.
All right. So this
Lucerna,
might.
let me start your 15 minutes.
All right. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, I'm gonna make my case for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So, starting off, in the case of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, there are numerous witness testimonies to use as sources to attest to the event. Now, witness testimony is threefold. There is eyewitness testimony, testimony at second hand, and then oral tradition. For the crucifixion, all three testimonies are plausible. We have the synoptics, we have people who bear second-hand witness to the crucifixion, and then we have oral tradition. But I'm going to use second-hand witness because for a lot of people, the Gospels are inadmissible since they're written by Christian writers, and then oral tradition, that's the thing that he puts into question. So I present to you the hostile witnesses to the crucifixion who, although pagan or Jew, attest to the cross of Christ. The first of these three witnesses being Bar Pinon, whose beliefs are debated by scholars, but most assume him to be a pagan, although there are some who say he was a monotheist of some sort. However, it does not matter in the endgame because we know he's not a Christian. What we do know is that he was a Stoic philosopher from the Roman province of Syria living in the 1st century and wrote a letter in Aramaic to his son, which dates roughly to the 1st century. The letter reads, "What else can we say when the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants? Their wisdom is captured by insults, and their minds are oppressed and without defense. What advantage did the Athenians gain from murdering Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as a punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the state of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new law he had laid down. Now we see in this letter four things: his condemnation of tyrants who execute the wise, his reference to Christ as the wise king, the consequences of executing the wise, and a reference to what he calls the new law which he had laid down when referring to the wise king. We can trace all these references to connect them back to the Christ. We know in the gospel it was the Pharisees who were the authority to the Jews who had executed the Christ. We know a tyrant is defined as a cruel and oppressive ruler, and we know the Pharisees are cruel and oppressive in nature, as we can see from the gospel and the way they had crucified the Christ, practiced various superstitions and fruitless works of the law, and condemned those who had not wickedly. Therefore, we can conclude the Pharisees are tyrannical in nature. From this, we can further conclude Mara's condemnation of the tyrannical murder of those who are wise is fitting in the case of the crucifixion of the Christ. The second reference is to Christ, is where he says the Jews have executed their wise king. Now, he does not call Christ by his name, most likely out of fear of persecution, as most scholars speculate, since the Romans and the Jews had started to suppress Christianity, or perhaps was not educated on the matter. Scholars speculate that he had referred to Christ as the King of the Jews due to the mockery of the Christ on the cross and the inscription King of the Jews on his cross, as told in Christian tradition. Furthermore, such a title was attributed to Christ during his ministry and crucifixion, so it most likely could have been used by the Jewish Christians of the time. The third reference to Christ connects to the former. Mara makes a reference to the wise King of the Jews, whom we know as Christ. Once more, he says, "What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished." We know that following the death of Christ, a great war between the Jews and the Romans had initiated, eventually resulting in the Roman reclaiming of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple as Christ had prophesied in Mark 13, 1-2. Lastly, we can examine the last reference to Christ in the letter. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new law he had laid down. We must also take into account the purpose of this letter in a contextual analysis. Mara's city had been overtaken by the Romans, and Mara had been imprisoned. He writes this to his son to encourage him to pursue wisdom, as wisdom does not fail you at the end. He writes, when the wise are persecuted, not only does their wisdom triumph in the end, but God also punishes their persecuted. Now he refers to the greatest works of these men in the last part of his letter. For Socrates, a student of Plato, one of the wisest philosophers in history, and also through one we know the teachings of Socrates. For Pythagoras of Samos, not the other Pythagoras, his sculpture, particularly that of the pagan goddess Juno, regarded as his best work. For the wise king of the Jews, he says the new law he had laid down. And we know Christ had established a new covenant, preaching a stumbling block to the Jews, as the apostle writes. A law of love and forgiveness, and many things which the Pharisees had known not, as written in the verses like Matthew 9:10-13, Matthew 15:1-9, Luke 6:6-11, Mark 7:5-13, John 8:3-11. Therefore, it is only reasonable that this wise king of the Jews is Christ, and as Mara writes, Christ was killed under their reign. The second of these witnesses being Thales, who we have lost many works of, but we can learn of his works with the Christian historian Julius Africanus. Julius writes of Thales, on the whole world there pressed a fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thales, in his third book of his history, calls, as appeared to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. So he writes other stuff, but it's from a Christian perspective on what the crucifixion was, and particularly he's referencing the darkness that happened at the crucifixion. What Africanus is trying to say here essentially is that an eclipse can occur at Passover when the moon is full because it's diametrically opposite to the sun. Interesting as it is, the main point of this is Africanus quotes Thales' history, where the historian supposedly writes of darkness during the crucifixion and attempts to explain it through a naturalistic perspective using the eclipse. Now, the main question at hand would be, how do we know the darkness Thales refers to as the one at the crucifixion? Well, if you contextually analyze the text, Thales' reference to the darkness being an unexplainable event is most likely tied to the time of the crucifixion, given the historical context. The Passover celebration always occurs on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, which aligns with the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Thales would have been writing at the time where the events surrounding Jesus' crucifixion were known or talked about in the wider Roman Empire, even if he wasn't a Christian. The darkness which was mentioned by the early Christians as occurring at the time of Jesus' death would have been a notable event for people to comment on. So we can conclude the following from Thales and Africanus. We can reasonably conclude that from the darkness Thales refers to as the darkness of the crucifixion of Jesus, because Thales mentions an unusual darkness during an important historical event during the first century. Timing of the event fits the Passover, which is the time where Jesus was crucified. Julius Africanus explicitly connects Thales' explanation to the darkness of the crucifixion, even though Thales does not mention Jesus by name explicitly. As mentioned earlier, the darkness would have been a notable event for the people, particularly historians, to comment on, so they did. Particularly the Greek writer Phlegon of Tralles, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was a freedman of the Emperor Hadrian. Phlegon was, as a writer, usually produced works that recounted historical events, such as the Olympiads, a 16-book compendium of history. He wrote On Marvels, a collection of paranormal or fantastical events, and he wrote On Long-Lived Persons, which essentially was just a recounting of Roman people who lived to like the year 100. So we can see that he is a notable historian and he has produced many works that unfortunately have been lost to time. For the most part, can only be read through the lens of various authors that quote him, such as Eusebius, Photius, and more. But these are like later authors. Now, Phlegon, or Phlegon, I think that's how you pronounce his name, is quoted on the darkness of the crucifixion by the following authors: Origen, Africanus, once again, and Eusebius. Origen, now Phlegon is the 13th or 14th book of his chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, although falling into confusion about some things which refer to Peter as if referred to Jesus, but also testify that the result corresponded to his predictions. He referred to a description by Phlegon as an eclipse accompanied by earthquakes during the reign of Tiberius. That was the greatest eclipse of the sun, and that it became night in the 6th hour of the day. So that stars even appeared in the heavens. There was a great earthquake in Bithynia, and many things were overturned in Nicaea. Africanus says, so this is a quote that he writes about, what's his name? Thales. Phlegon records that in the time of the Tiberius Caesar at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th, manifestly that of one which we speak. Eusebius, in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was a great eclipse of the sun, greater than had ever been known before, for at the 6th hour of the day was changed into night, and the stars were seen in the heavens. An earthquake occurred in Bithynia and overthrew a great part of the city of Nicaea. So from both Phlegon and Taus's testimony, we can conclude that the darkness was present at the crucifixion and recorded in the Gospels, such as Matthew 27:45, Luke 23:44-45, and Mark 15:33. So we have Tacitus, a Roman historian and senator, referred to Jesus, his execution by Pontius Pilate, and the early Christians of Rome in his work Annals, book 15, chapter 44. So Tacitus was not sympathetic towards Christians and therefore considered a hostile witness. Contextually, Tacitus writes of Christ and his followers in relation to the Great Fire, for it is traditionally said that Nero, the emperor of Rome, had persecuted and blamed the Christians for the Great Fire. Tacitus says, but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations. Called Christians by the populace, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered from extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So the rest of the passage is just him bashing on Christians. I'm not going to read that. So Lucian of Samosata, a Hellenized Syrian satirist, rhetorician, and a historian, kind of, born in the 2nd century, writes of the Christians and the Christ crucified in a ridiculing manner. He says they are pathetic and are fond of a man named Proterus, who lived and was close in relation to them. He mocked them satirically by saying they loved him until the point they referred him as a god. He then, in a mocking manner, proceeded to draw a comparison between their reverence to the Christ, who he says was crucified in Palestine. Then he mocks the belief of the Christians. Lucian says, is it then that he, Proteus, learned the wondrous lore of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestine? And how else could it be? In a trice Proteus made them all look like children, for he was a prophet, cult leader, head of the synagogue, and everything all by himself. He interpreted and explained some of their books, and even composed many. And they referred him as a god, made use of him as a lawgiver, and set him down as a protector, next after that other. To be sure, whom they still worship, the man who was crucified in Palestine, because he introduced this new cult into the world. And at length Proteus was apprehended for this and thrown into prison. The Christians, regarding the incident as a calamity, left nothing undone in the effort to rescue him. So it was then, in the case of I don't know how to pronounce the Roman name. Much money came to him from then by reason of this imprisonment. And he procured not only little revenue from it, the poor wretches have convinced themselves, first and foremost, that they are going to be immortal and live for all time, in consequence of which they despise death and even willingly give themselves into custody.
3 minutes left.
All right. I'm not going to read the rest because it's just mocking Jesus. So I'm going to move on to the prophecy since I don't have much time. So Psalms 21 or 22, if you go by the numbering of the new translations, reads, O God, my God, look upon me. Why hast thou forsaken me? Far from my salvation are the words of my sins. O my God, I shall cry by day, and thou wilt not hear, and by night, and it shall not be reputed as folly to me. But thou dwellest in the holy place, the praise of Israel, and thee have our fathers hoped, they have hoped, and thou hast delivered them. They cried to thee, and they were saved. They trusted in thee, and they were not confounded. But I am a worm, no man, the reproach of men and the outcast of the people. All they saw me have laughed me to scorn. They have spoken me with the lips and wagged the head. He hoped in the Lord, let him deliver him, let him save him, seeing he delighted in them. For thou art he that hast drawn me out of the womb. My hope from the breast of my mother. I was cast upon thee from the womb. From my mother's womb, thou art my God. Depart not from me, for tribulation is very near. For there is no one to help me. Many calves have surrounded me, fat bulls have besieged me. They have opened their mouth against me as a lion ravening and roaring. I was poured out like water, and all my bones were scattered. My heart is becoming like wax melting in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue hath cleaved to my jaws. And thou hast brought me down to the dust of death. For many dogs have encompassed me. The counsel of the malignant hath besieged me. They have dug my hands and feet. They have numbered all my bones, and they have looked and stared upon me. They parted my garments amongst them, and upon my vesture they cast lots. But thou, O Lord, remove me not to help a distance from me. look towards my defense. Deliver, O God, my soul from the sword, my only one from the hand of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, and my lowness from the horns of the unicorns. I will declare thy name to my brethren in the midst of the church. Will I praise thee? Ye that fear the Lord, praise him. All ye the seed of Jacob, glorify him. Let all the seed of Israel fear him, because he hath not slighted nor despised the supplication of the poor man. Neither hath he turned away his face from me, and when I cried out, he heard from me. With thee is the praise in the great church. I will pay my vows in the sight of them that fear him. The poor shall eat and shall be filled, and they shall praise the Lord that seek them. Their hearts shall live forever and ever. All the ends of the earth shall remember, and shall be converted to the Lord. All the kindreds of the Gentiles shall adore in his sight, for the kingdom is the Lord's, and he shall have dominion over the nations. All the fat ones of the earth have eaten and adored. All that go down to the earth shall fall before him, and to him my soul shall live, and my seed shall serve him. There shall be declared to the Lord a generation to come, and the heavens shall shew forth his justice to a people that shall be born, which is the Lord hath made.
That's time.
All right, let me know when to start my timer.
Wait, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, go
Okay,
ahead.
go ahead. Let him.
So, I'm not gonna read it, but my other prophecy is Wisdom 2:12-20. I'm not gonna read the full thing because I can't like analyze or anything, but I'll do that in my next time I get to speak.
All right, the next thing is gonna be the first rebuttal. You set it up and it'll be 8 minutes long. Abdulaziz, go ahead, start.
Beautiful. Okay, so first, when it comes to Tacitus, I'm putting all the sources in the side chat if anyone wants them. Right here, we have Tacitus, the unreliability of his works, him not even mentioning the crucifixion as a punishment. He didn't mention that. I'm glad he didn't. Right? When it comes to his excellent manuscripts being from the 9th to 11th century, when it comes to him just not being a first-hand witness, not being contemporary to the time, and him just recording what Christians were believing in his time, and him mocking them, right, for worshiping a God who receives the ultimate punishment, we can't even tie this back to crucifixion. I told you they interpret it in many different ways, and I put it in the side chat. They interpret it as either ultimate punishment could mean him being burnt, or him being executed by way like beheading, and him being the third one. I forgot the third one, which they bring up. Or him being thrown to the lions. There's multiple ways to interpret the ultimate punishment. So he doesn't even mention, and they give you the exact Greek for what he could have mentioned in regards to the crucifixion. He doesn't even mention this. When it comes to the other sources that he brings, when it comes to, this is Michael Lacona, this is what I was talking about. When it comes to, I'm going to read in the side chat. For anyone who wants to read along with me, the resurrection of Jesus, a new historical approach, Michael or Lacona. Okay, so Pliny the Younger, right? This is one of the guys. I don't know. So he bring up Suetonius. He bring up Maraberis Sopian. I'm pretty sure he bring up Thales around AD 55. Thales wrote a history of the Eastern Mediterranean world from the Trojan War until AD 50. Although no longer extant portions of his writings have been preserved by others of interest to us, Christian author named Julius Africanus, the Christian author who comes in the year 2020, who interacts with Thales's works. Unfortunately, that text is likewise lost. However, a section is cited by Georgius Silenius in AD 800 AD, right? Speaking of the portents that occurred at the death of Jesus, Julius Africanus comments on the whole world there pressed the most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thales in the third book of history calls an appearance to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. Through a third-hand source, Thales Africanus Silensis, it appears that a historian named Thales made note of the darkness that occurred at the time of Jesus. Although this text cannot be ignored, it is not very useful, right? We cannot know based on the information we have, which unfortunately comes from a man 700 years removed from Thales, and who received his information from another source about 165 years removed from Thales. And he doesn't even mention the resurrecting of the saints and them going around into the temple. This is something that he surely would have mentioned if there was a academic, or if there was a consensus that this event happened, that this event took place, even though Paul doesn't agree with it, even though Josephus doesn't mention it, even though none of the other gospel writers corroborate this event, and it would have been most likely from a pagan holiday or pagan tradition, right? Next thing's next. Okay, he brings up Psalms 22. It's funny that Psalms 22 is used in the secret book of John right here to prove that Jesus was saved, right? If you read the verses 19 through 24, it'll talk about God calling upon the one, right here. Let's read it together. Psalms 22. Verse 19 through 24. So Lutheran has to understand that there was many groups within the 1st and 2nd century that were claiming apostolic succession, that were saying our beliefs are solidified in the Bible, and that were even using messianic prophecies to prove that Jesus was saved. I'll bring up two examples right here. Right here in the this is the secret book of John, right? It says, "And I was in the mouths of the lions, and the plan which they devised about to release me in their error and their senselessness, I did not succumb to them as they had planned, but I was not afflicted at all." Right? Read verse 19 from the Psalms. It says like that he calls upon, like in his time of affliction, he's calling upon God, and God did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. Rather, he heard his prayers. He heard his prayers. What was Jesus' prayers? Matthew chapter 26, verse 39, you'll see one of his prayers. God, Father, take this cup away from me, for not my will be done, but yours. This is something that Jesus mentions as well, right? Then the scholars interpreted the cup as representing, like, take this cup away from me. The cup represents the death and suffering that he'll have to endure, and so he's praying against the crucifixion. This is in the Gospel of Matthew. In the Gospel of Luke, he prays once. In the Gospel of Matthew, he prays 3 times with his head on the ground like a Muslim, right? But in the Gospel of Luke, he prays once, and even says, even though this is an inserted passage, it even says that he was sweating out blood for how scared he was of the crucifixion. So right here, Secret Acts of John is saying, using Psalms 22 to deny the crucifix. And you need to understand that there's many groups doing this. The Basilidians, they were doing this as well. I put the source in the side chat. The Basilidians right here, they claimed apostolic succession running through Glossius, from Peter to Matthias to Jesus. This is their apostolic succession. And in their gospel, the Basilidian gospel, it says, he, Christ, appeared on earth as a man and performed miracles. Thus himself, he did not suffer. Rather, a certain man, Simon of Cyrene, was compelled to carry his cross for him. It was he, Simon, who was ignorantly and erroneously crucified, and being transfigured by him, so that Simon might be thought to be Jesus. SubhanAllah, it appeared to them so. Moreover, Jesus assumed the form of Simon and stood by laughing at them. With regard to accounting for Jesus' laughter, R.M. Grant notes the likely Old Testament foundation of Basilidia's reinterpretation of Jesus' passion in the light of Psalms 2. They're quoting Psalms 2 to prove that Jesus was ascended into the heavens. And right here, read at the bottom of this page, Psalm, which we know was interpreted messianically by the early Christians. Psalms 2 begins with a picture of the archons in the Septuagint conspiring against the Lord and his anointed. Psalms 2 talks about the ones who are conspiring against the Lord and his anointed. And it goes on to say that he who sits in the heaven laughs. Right, so they were using this to say Simon of Cyrene was the one who was crucified instead. They plotted, they devised, they schemed against Jesus, and they tried killing him. And Jesus was ascended into the heavens, and he was laughing down at them because they crucified someone else. And he was, they quote Psalms 22, and they say this is a messianic prediction of Jesus being raised and being saved. Right, it's the messianic prophecies. Like I can bring them up many more. I can bring up one of my own. Right, that I can make a really strong argument from that talks about Jesus being delivered, being protected, being honored, being saved. His the salvation will be shown to him. No evil will come near him. No scourge will come near his tent. The angels will be given to him, and regarding all his ways, and they'll lift him up lest he dash his foot against the stone. Psalms 91, verse 10 through 16. I can bring you the Augustine and what he says about this. We can go over this prophecy in my next rebuttal. I'm going to bring up every single document. I already addressed all the witnesses that he put in the side chat. I already read over the main one that he brought with Thalanus, right? And the other ones that he mentioned as well are we can go over them very easily. They're all mentioned in the source. I already knew he was going to bring every single one of these sources. I've independently studied every single one of these, and I know the scholarly quotes in regards to them. All deem them as irreliable. Extant manuscripts come much later on. They're not corroborating similar events. They're not addressing the crucifixion. Testimonium Flavinium is inserted, is an interpolation. Tacitus's writings are unreliable. He doesn't even mention, he's not a first-hand witness or anything like this. And these other guys as well, they're coming much later on, and they're not writing anything pertaining to the crucifixion, anything contemporary to it, and their works are unreliable. Like what Michael Licona. Michael Licona is the evangelical. I'm not quoting any atheist or secular scholars. This is Michael Licona is a Christian scholar. Right here, we're going to go over every single document within the 1st century and 2nd century that denies the crucifix. Okay, here, denial, right? And denial in science. Okay, so whether you like them or not, these are historical sources. History is based on writings and testimonies, not theology. If we're using the historical critical method, history knows no religion, and it only knows reliable and unreliable. Okay, so right here, the first Christian source that there's academic consensus that exists is the Q source, right? 35 from the years 35 to 50 CE is silent on the passion and crucifixion narrative. The Epistle of James, silent and silent on the crucifixion and passion narrative. The Epistle of Jude, late 1st century, silent and on the crucifixion and passion narrative. The Didache, silent on the narrative. The Gospel of the Nazarenes, from the year 70 to 100 CE, silent on the crucifixion and passion narrative. Gospel of the Ebionites, movement in the late 1st century, and the Gospel is from 120 CE, silent on the crucifixion. Right? Gospel of Thomas, 2nd century, but some argue that it can be traced back to the 1st century, silent. And John Dominique Croissant says Thomas is from 50 to 70 CE. The Shepherd of Hermes, silent on the crucifixion. This is from 80 to 100 CE. Right? 6 from the 1st century, 2nd from the 2nd. 2 from the 2nd century, and this is basically documents that would have been going around, traditions that would have been passing down, all claiming to be the authentic teachings of Christ, and no one was holding any significance or any importance to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, except for Paul and his Christology and his soteriology and his theology that he needs Jesus to be crucified so he can redeem us from the curse of law. Right? Here's denial sources. Gospel of Judas, 150 to 180 CE, 2nd century, chapter 53 says, another man who will bear my cross and suffer in my place. Okay, the Apocalypse of Peter. So we're going over works that are attributed to these disciples, to these people. people, traditions that lead back to them. The Apocalypse of Peter, 81, dated to 130 CE. Peter having a vision of Jesus sitting on a tree while watching another man who resembles him. Exactly what the Quran says, وَشُبِّهَ لَهُمْ, right? A denial. This is a denial of the crucifix. A second treatise of Great Seth, mid-2nd century, denial, says Simon transfigured and looked like Jesus, a denial of the crucifixion. Gospel of the Basilidians, early to mid-2nd century. They have apostolic succession. I named them. Glossius, so Basilidian says from Glossius to Peter to Matthias to Jesus. So they have apostolic succession
30
as well.
seconds.
Actually, Secret Acts of John says in 150 CE, it says he only appeared to have suffered. I bring up that source in the side channel. I'll put every single one of these sources. Any source that he wants, call it out. I'll bring it. The letter to the Magnesians. We're going to discuss the Jewish Christians in my next rebuttal. We're going to discuss the Jewish Christians. I'm going to prove that the Hawariyun were in the 1st century. We're propagating the view that Jesus wasn't crucified. I'm going to bring up scholarship as well. The letter to the Magnesians, 1st century denial. The letter to the Philadelphians, it talks about Ignatius of Antioch arguing with groups who were not believing in were not believing in Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. They were making arguments like he only appeared to suffer. He didn't suffer. And they make arguments that it's not an original document, so why would we affirm it? And he says that they're denying that the death of Jesus Christ, and I'll bring you scholarship on this as well, right? Multiple, if I can say one more thing, all right? The
Go
letter
ahead.
to the Trallians, 1st century, Paul's writings debating those who denied and belittled the crucifix from Jerusalem's pillars, and the early Jewish Christian groups' denial, right? I can bring up from Paul's writings, Apocryphal of James, dated to 100 to 200 CE, denial of the crucifix. 10 documents that deny the crucifix, 8 are silent on the crucifix. 10 of these documents are from the 1st century, and 8 of them are from the 2nd century, which puts a huge hole in the whole idea that everyone was unanimously agreeing
All right.
upon the crucifixion of Jesus Christ within the 1st and 2nd century. My bad.
Okay, good, good.
Give him an extra 30 seconds if you'd like.
All right. Lucerna, you ready for your first
Yeah.
rebuttal?
Yeah. So
The time starts now. Go ahead.
okay, so he addressed so most of his first opening statement didn't mention any of the sources that I used. Like he mentioned Josephus, that was a big portion of his opening statement. I didn't mention Josephus, and he mentioned what was it, Papias? I didn't mention him either. So he did speak against Tacitus, and he said I think he said his sources are unreliable because they're outdated, but that's just pretty dumb because the epistemology is ridiculous to base an argument on the dating of a manuscript because ancient identities aren't defined solely by their manuscripts. It's an intrinsic web of ancient textual principles. So I don't know where he got that from. And there's like other stuff, like for example, Aristotle, like most of his manuscripts are kind of medieval, kind of, and he's back there like in BCE. So if you want to base off historical knowledge just off of when the manuscript dates to, then I don't think that's sufficient. And he mentioned I think he said something about the prophecy. Wait, what did you say about the prophecy? He said something about, oh yeah, the Basilidians. So the Basilidians, they claimed apostolic succession, but there's no way to actually verify that because if you actually look at what the Gnostics believed, it was very different from what was in the Gospels and what the original disciples would have believed. So the Basilidians, what did I write against the Basilidians? So the Basilidians, we know nothing of Basilidians except he was a Gnostic who affirmed Gnostic beliefs. That being Christ was not crucified solely because he believed Christ did not have a body of matter, and another being Christ had shapeshifted into Simon while Simon was shapeshifted into Christ. Then Christ laughed at Simon because he was crucified, and again, he possessed the absurd Gnostic beliefs of an evil God because he thought all matter was evil or something. And then it was finally rumored that he heard this from St. Matthias. St. Matthias was a substitution for Judas, so if you really believe that Peter, the disciple of Jesus himself, omitted Matthias and approved of his membership of the 12 apostles in replacement of Judas, and somehow was ignorant of all his Gnostic views that apparently he taught to, Basilides, then I think that's pretty absurd, and it's very dishonest. The Gnostics did not have a set substitution theory. Their belief of substitution was born from the belief regarding matter and the divinity of Jesus. I find it highly ironic you're kind of picking and choosing aspects of the Gnostic belief. You're saying, oh, they didn't believe this aspect of the crucifixion, therefore, the early centuries of Christianity did not believe in the crucifixion. He was drawing similarities between the Quranic narrative, and then it's just cherry picking. So that's what I have to say against them. And he said something about the early Christians didn't believe the crucifixion. I'm pretty sure he's probably going to bring up the Ebionites, and I can argue against them too. For Psalm, for Psalms 90 or 91, if you're going to go by the newer numbering, because I go by the Vulgate, he said, Christ cried out. So was it Psalm? Which Psalm was it? Okay, so it was Psalm 6-9. He said, "They cried out to thee, and they were saved. They trusted in thee, yet they were not confounded. But I am a worm and no man." So basically, this is where he says Jesus cried out on the cross, or he says the psalm predicts that the Messiah, will cry out, and then he will be saved. But it doesn't exactly say that he prayed for salvation or anything. It says he cried out, and we know on the cross, Christ cries out, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." So that's one thing to note. So his idea that this prophecy is actually referring to when Christ says, "Father, let this cup pass from me," or when he did not want to go, because we know Christ did not want to go to the crucifix. He did it because his Father willed it. That's absurd, and there's no basis for that. So that's what I have to say against his argument. Yeah.
You have 4 more minutes. Do you want to use the rest of it, or do you want to give it up?
Sure. For the most part, he did argue against the Gospels, right? So he argued against the Gospels. He cited a lot. First of all, he cited a lot of false Gospels. He cited the Gospel of Judas, the secret Gospel of Mark. I don't know what the secret Gospel of Mark is, or the secret Gospel of John. These are unknown Gospels, and I don't know why you take them as authority, because the early church rejected them. So to prove Gospel authorship, I'm going to use Origen, Tertullian, and Irenaeus. And because in the early centuries, these are the early church fathers. So Origen writes, "Concerning the 4 Gospels, which alone are unconverted to the church of God under heaven, I have learned by tradition that the Gospel according to Matthew, who was at one time a publican and afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, was written first, and that he composed it in the Hebrew tongue and published it for the converts from Judaism. The second written was that according to Mark, who wrote it according to the instruction of Peter, who in his general epistle acknowledged him as a son, saying, The church that is in Babylon, elect together with you, salutes you, and so does Mark my son. And third was that according to Luke, the gospel commended by Paul, which he composed with the converts from the Gentiles. Last of all, that according to John." And this is a commentary on Matthew 1. So he also says, "The same authority of the apostolic churches who will afford evidence from the other gospels also, which we possess equally through their means, and according to their usage. I mean the gospels of John and Matthew, whilst that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was, for even Luke's form of the gospel men usually ascribe to Paul, and it may well seem that the works which the disciples published belong to their masters." So this is written against Marcion, 4.5. So we lay it down as our first position that the Evangelical Testament has apostles for its authors, to one was assigned by the Lord himself, this office of publishing the gospel of the apostles. Therefore, John and Matthew first instilled faith unto us, while apostolic men, Luke and Mark, renew it afterwards. These all start from the same principles of the faith, so far as relates to the one only God, the Creator, and his Christ, how he was born of the Virgin and came to fulfill the law and the prophets. Irenaeus in 180 AD writes, "Matthew also issued a written gospel amongst the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia." And this is against heresies. This means that by 180 AD, we have solid historical literary evidence that the early church confirmed that the 4 New Testament Gospels were indeed written by Matthew and John, 2 apostles, and Mark, a close associate of Peter and Luke, a close associate of Paul, and 2 other apostles. So from this we can note 4 things. All the authors would have written in the 1st century and died by its close.
1 minute
Matthew
left.
was written during the time where Peter and Paul were founding the church in Rome. Mark wrote when Peter's death at the request of the Roman Christians, and Luke wrote under the authority of the Apostle Paul. So that's what I have to say here.
Do you give the rest of your time? I gave you an extra 30 seconds, so do you want to give up the extra 30 seconds?
No.
All right, okay. Then Abdulaziz, you ready for your next rebuttal?
Of course.
All right.
Hi.
I'm gonna start the timer in 3, 2. All right, go ahead, start.
Beautiful, beautiful. Wait 1 second. Let me start my timer. Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. All right, beautiful. Jewish Christianity. I'm going to be like making an argument for the Hawaii. So he's saying I'm appealing to Docetists. He's saying I'm appealing to the monophysites. He's saying I'm appealing to the people who believe in an angelic figure or a spiritual figure of Christ and that he didn't have like a an actual body or anything like this. Right? These are some groups, and this is what the Quran says. Right? The Quran says, وقولهم إن قتلنا المسيح عيسى ابن مريم رسول الله وما قتلوه وما صلبوه ولكن شبه لهم وإن الذين اختلفوه فيه لفي شك. Right? So we know that there was people who were having difference of opinion. I already addressed this, right? There was ikhtilaf, there was difference of opinion, there was done, they were following conjecture, they were following hearsay. They had no ilm, they had no knowledge, they weren't getting it from reputable sources. Right here, I'm going to make a very strong case that the Jewish Christians in Paul's time, in the first century, arguing with Ignatius. I'm going to bring up scholars, every single source is in the side chat, every single source is in the side chat right here. We're going to read on the early, okay, right here, this is Ignatius's writings. This is a letter to the Trallians. Okay, it's going to take a second to send. 1 second. Okay, beautiful. Right here in the side chat. Right here. So the letter to the Trallians. But if, as some are that are without God, that is unbelieving, say that he only seemed to suffer, they themselves only seeming to exist, then why am I in bonds? Why do I long to be exposed to the wild beasts? Do I therefore die in vain? Am I not one of the guilty in falsehood against the cross of the Lord? He's saying people are saying he appeared to suffer. He appeared to suffer, but he didn't really suffer. Okay, right here, early Christian church fathers, Cyril C. Richardson, where he goes over the letter to the Philadelphians. Right here, he writes, this is Ignatius writing to the Philadelphians. I urge you to do not do things in cliques, but act as Christ's disciples. So he's addressing Christians, right? When I heard some of the people saying, if I don't find it in the original documents, remember when I mentioned all the original documents within the first century that didn't have any crucifixion, any passion narrative? When it said, I don't believe it in the they said, if I don't find it in the original documents, I don't believe it in the gospel. I answered them, but it is written there. They retorted, that's just the question. To me, my mind, it is that Jesus Christ who is in the original documents. The inviolable archives are his cross and death and his resurrection and the faith that came by him. This is a letter to the Philadelphians. We already saw the letter to the Trallians where they says he only appeared to suffer. Right here, they're saying it's not in our original document. So why would we affirm this, Ignatius? Why would we affirm this if it's not in original documents? The crucifixion and the passion narrative. Why would we affirm this? Right here in the letter to the Philadelphians, he says, I urge you to not do things in cliques. But wait, no, right here. Okay, this is his letter to the Magnesians. Those then who lived by ancient practices arrived at a new hope. They ceased to keep the Sabbath and lived by the Lord's day, on which our life as well as theirs shone forth. Thanks to him and his death, though some deny this, though some deny his life and his death, though some deny this, through this mystery we got our faith, and because of it we stand on our ground, so as to become disciples of Jesus Christ, our sole teacher. 3 sources right here, and you're going to say that they might be Docetists or something like this. This is why I bring the scholarly quote right here. Give me 1 second to read it. Okay, I have to find it because there's too many people typing in the side chat. 1 second. Okay, beautiful. Right here. So this is from the scholar. This is from the scholar, Dr. Matti Malakowski, right? And he says that this group did not have Docetist beliefs. He says that this group were Christians which were influenced and held to beliefs earlier by Jewish Christian influence. The heresy opposed in Ephesians, Trallians, and Cimmerians, in turn denied the incarnation, true bodily suffering, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he says, particularly in Trallians chapter 9 and 10, and Cimmerians chapter 1 through 4. And this is a first century source, right? The Ignatius' writings. This is traditions that are existing within the first century. Even though most scholars take these adversaries to be Docetists, there are some serious problems with this theory. Unlike other known Docetists, the preachers whom Ignatius has attacked did not proclaim a separate God that is superior to the creator God. Furthermore, right, so he's indicating that these are Jewish Christians that are affirming a prophetic Messiah, not a divinic Messiah. Furthermore, their activity must be dated clearly earlier than that of Saturninus, whose theology has been presented as the most likely parallel to them. The polemics of Ignatius do not reveal that his opponents would have denied the earthly body of Jesus. So his whole point, I'm appealing to monophysites, I'm appealing to Docetists, shut down. These are first century sources, Jewish Christians. This whole idea, I know, the monophysitism and the Docetism, it erupts in the 2nd century, and they all saying like, Jesus was transfigured and things like this. First century, these people are saying he only appeared to suffer. We do not find in our original documents. Why would we believe in this? And they say, and he says that they reject his death. They say that Jesus didn't die, and they affirm a prophetic Messiah, right? And within Jewish Christianity, I put you from Alan F. Siegel, they're the majority within the first century. So the majority of the Jewish Christians who didn't agree with Paul's Christology, Paul's soteriology, Paul's idea on theology, Paul's abolishment of the law, right? They're over here arguing against this. Even in his writings, I bring you the verses from Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. He says, "Oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Didn't we publicly portray Jesus as crucified too?" You read Galatians chapter 3, verse 1, and Galatians chapter 3, verse 2. And I can show you scholars that tie the Evion, the people, the poor ones that John and Cephas tell him to remember all throughout his writings, and he addresses them. The poor ones, they would be classified as the Ebionites. I can show you the scholarship where they tie them back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, where they tie them back to Isaiah 66, where they tie them to Paul's writings as well. But these are Ebionites. These are Jewish Christians that would have been under James from the years 30 to 80 CE, right? And the Jewish Christianity, we know I put a source by L&F Siegel, where it says Jewish Christianity is the majority in the first century, right? And he says in the second century, they started dispersing, that they were no longer like prevailing, right? They affirmed a prophetic Messiah and not a divinic Messiah. They did hold to the virgin birth. I can prove this easily. They believed the scriptures of the Old Testament were tainted. They rejected substitution, atonement, or blood sacrifices, and they contested the crucifix in the time of Paul. They were followers of John the Baptist, then James, then Jesus, then James. They despised Paul and his teachings and have many writings criticizing him. You know the famous one, Epistola Petra, where the letter attributed to Paul, or the letter attributed to Peter, who's writing to James, like he calls Paul the enemy of mine, the enemy of God, an apostate from the law, rejects his claim to have seen the risen Christ. All these things, right? So the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, I would make very strong arguments that the Jewish Christians originally did not believe and affirm the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, did not believe in vicarious substitution atonement. Paul is arguing with them in Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. Interestingly enough, he mentioned 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23. Right here, I have a scholar, right? Give me 2 seconds. Right here, he mentioned 1 Corinthians, a stumbling block to the Jews. Remember the stumbling block to the Jews? Right here, and this is Paul addressing the church divided over leaders, and this is where Paul's like saying in his writings that I am vindicated, that I'm professing for Christ, that this gospel was taught to me by Christ, that I don't seek any validation, that I can go and preach this message on my own. Right here, Unlocking the Puzzle by David Oliver Smith. Right here, he says the Jews Paul is speaking of right here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, or 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23. We preach Christ, a stumbling block to the Jews, and the Jews that Paul is speaking of here, direct quote, the Jews that Paul is speaking of here who do not recognize that Christ was crucified are the Jerusalem's pillars, James, Peter, and John, who reject Paul's Christ, a synthesis of Isaiah's suffering servant with Daniel, son of man. We know that the early groups, how they rejected how the Jewish Christians, they were in conformity to the law. They upheld the customs and traditions and the ordinances of the Old Testament. Paul was deviating away from this. They pressed Paul, James presses Paul in Acts chapter 21, verse 18 through 24, when he tells them, when he makes them retake the Nazarite vow, shave his head, go with 4 other men, and do a sin offering. And he tells them that like everyone will know that you're no longer like teaching against the law, even though we see that Paul was clearly teaching against the law in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24 to 28, where he says we're no longer under this disciplinarian, we're no longer under this guardian of the Mosaic covenant, and now we are under Christ's law. And then he even boasts about his two-facedness in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20 through 22. So Paul was going around preaching this soteriology, appeasing the pagans and the Gentiles, teaching them this idea of a mythological man, God, savior that would have been completely common with Mithraism, with Adonis, with Dionysus. Justin Martyr quotes in his first apology, chapter 21, where he talks about like Dionysus, the sons of Zeus, and he correlates it to the logos, two-stage logos theology, where like they say that a man God was basically born in a unique way, and that he died and he was crucified, or he died and he resurrected up into the heavens, and that he was doing miracles, and we propagate nothing new or different from what you pagans believe, right? So we can see that this is a clear template that's being placed forth, like a mythological man, God, savior, who comes down, redeems his people, introduces some sort of Eucharist, introduces all these custom traditions and holidays, and we see this Jesus, they're worshiping Dionysus masqueraded as Jesus, basically, right? And this isn't the historical Jesus. All right, so I want you to address the Jewish Christians in Paul's congregation, the Jewish Christians who were denying the crucifix to Ignatius, and the scholar that I bring up mentioning Docetism, and how these are not Docetists, these are not monophysites, they affirmed a bodily Christ, and we can go into this more. Okay.
All right.
That's time?
Yes.
My bad. If I went over, please give me extra time.
You're good. All right. Lucerno, you ready for your second and last?
Yeah, hold on. I'm just pulling up the verse.
All right. After we do this, we'll have 8 minutes cross exams for each person. We'll start with Abdulaziz. Basically, it'll be questions from Abdulaziz that Lucerno will have to answer. Then we will shift it after 8 minutes for Lucerno to ask his questions to Abdulaziz.
Sounds good.
All right,
Lucerno, your time starts now. Go ahead.
So you wanted me to address the Ebionites, or the early Jewish Christians that he thinks are going to believe in the crucifixion, and he gets this evidence because he says Paul, the apostle, innovated the crucifixion. So he gets that from Galatians 3:1, where he says, "Foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? We preach Christ crucified." So this is not exactly what Paul means here, because when Paul criticizes people and says we preach Christ crucified, like he says in 1 Corinthians, I think it was chapter 2, verse 2, he tells people that they're straying from the path of what Christ was taught. And then he tells you we preach Christ crucified. We represent Christ crucified. So stick to the path. Stop doing weird stuff. And he also mentioned 1 Corinthians 1:20-25, where he says the crucifixion is a stumbling block to the Jews. If you read the context, it says, where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of the world? Hath God not made foolish the wisdom of this world? For seeing that in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God, if pleased God by the foolishness of our preaching to save them that believe. For both the Jews require signs and the Greeks seek after wisdom. So here he does not only say that the cross is a stumbling block to the Jews, he says it's a stumbling block unto the Gentiles too. So he says it's a stumbling block because the Jews require signs. They want signs from Christ that he's the Messiah. And obviously they're very similar to the modern Jews who say stuff like, oh, why did Christ not deliver us from Israel, or deliver us from the Gentiles and bring us back to Israel and give us a kingdom, because that's what they expected the Messiah to be. And he also says the Greeks who seek wisdom, because the Greeks were philosophers and they cannot, because Christ came with a lot of supernatural truths, and the Greeks being very into that tradition of philosophy, were usually had a rationalistic approach to most things. Like, as you can see from Tallis, who try to explain the darkness of the crucifixion with an eclipse through a naturalistic lens. So we see that when Paul says Christ crucified is a stumbling block to the Jews, he doesn't mean that the Jews are essentially James, Peter, or whoever you said they were, the pillars of Jerusalem. I don't even know where you got that from, but he says it's a stumbling block to the Jews who reject Christ, because Christ is something that they did not expect. They're a stumbling block to the Jews because the Jews did not expect him to be the Messiah. They wanted more signs that he was the Messiah. They wanted him to actually be delivered from the cross. That's why they taunt him on the cross. They say, if you're the Messiah, or if you're the Son of God, save yourself. And he couldn't save himself, so it's a stumbling block to them. And he also says to the Gentiles, if he was specifically talking about the Jerusalem pillars, then he would mention them. But he actually talks about the Gentiles too. He says to the Gentiles foolishness, and he says the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than them. So this is what Paul is essentially saying when he says the crucifixion is a stumbling block to the Jews. And he also wanted me to address the Ebionites, which are essentially the early Jewish Christians. So first of all, for the Ebionites, for the most part, we only can study them through the lens of the church fathers. Like, the church fathers cited them, the church fathers wrote polemics against them. We don't actually have that much sources on who the Ebionites were. They did. So what we do know about them is that they had some very strict traditions. They had a tradition of vegetarianism. They rejected all sorts of animal sacrifices, which would not only contradict the Quranic. Pretty sure the Muslims have this sacrifice of goat, right, on Eid or something. And they also reject the Jewish animal sacrifices in the Old Testament. So they reject Levitical sacrifices. And then they reject, so they're vegetarians, so they also rejected meat that's considered permissible in Jewish law. And they rejected the virgin birth of Christ, which is inherently blasphemous in both religions, of both Islam and Christianity. So to consider these people the early Christians, because first of all, because when we talked, you said the disciples had attempted to spread the message of Christ, that he was not crucified. So if these are the people that they were, these people not only rejected the virgin birth of Christ, they altered the law of Moses. And the only reason they accused Paul is because they thought he was straying too far from the law of Moses, because Paul did preach against the Pharisees. He preached against a lot of the churches who were following the law of Moses strictly. So they thought he was straying from the law of Moses, which is hypocritical, because they themselves were also straying from the law of Moses by saying stuff like Moses promoted vegetarianism, he rejected animal sacrifices, and then they also blasphemed the Virgin Mary. So, and also most of them were Gnostics, so they also didn't even hold the fact that Christ had a physical body, which actually brings me to my next point. You said that the Quran affirms that there was a variety of views. Sure, there could have been even if it affirmed that, like, the thing is, you're drawing one similarity from this belief to the Quranic narrative, and it's just so absurd, because these people literally hold the most absurd view of Christ, but they just affirm the sole fact that he wasn't crucified due to their absurd view. They didn't affirm anything else. they had an absurd view of Christ that said he did not have a physical body, so they concluded from this that Christ was not crucified. This is like saying like a Hindu who rejects the crucifixion in like the 1st century that proves the Quranic narrative. Like this is so stupid. The Gnostics rejected the crucifixion because they did not believe Christ had a physical body in the first place. That's why they rejected them. And the Ebionites were also, for the most part, Gnostic. So if you want to say these people are the true followers of Christ in the 1st century, the Jewish Christians, then it's just absurd. That's all I have to say for my rebuttal.
Can I get 30 seconds to reply, like real quick?
Well,
Is
there
that cool
he
right now? Just
he
to
has
that point, real quick.
okay. You could do it in your cross exam if you want instead.
Hey, just real quick, like right here. Okay, so Origin Eusebius mentioned that they did believe in the virgin birth. Catholic Encyclopedia says some of the Ebionites accepted the virgin birth, others didn't. The vegetarianism is Epiphanius of Salamis' writings in the 4th century, where he talks about that they had some sort of idea of vegetarianism, but this is differing and this is straying off from the 1st century. And the adoptionist Christology comes in the 2nd century. Right here, I put a source for that, where adoptionist Christology comes in the 2nd century. So the earliest Ebionites were affirming the virgin birth. This is false. Eusebius and Origin make note of it. I put in the side chat. New Catholic Encyclopedia also tells you some of the Ebionites affirmed it and some of them rejected it. They believed the Old Testament was corrupt. They didn't trust the priests, the high priests, who were like trying to make a livelihood off of these animal sacrifices. And they said that the scripture was distorted, just like what Isa, they said, came to correct them on the message that they were correcting. My bad. If he wants to say anything, he can. Or we can get into the Q&A real quick.
Luciano, you want to say anything? If not, we can get into the cross exams.
Wait, what did he said something about they affirmed I'm saying there was a variety of views among them, obviously, like, but the fact that some of them didn't is just weird because these are the people that you're saying that had the true message of Jesus Christ, right?
Yeah, they would have had the original Hawariyun within the 1st century. They would have had, yes, the true beliefs of Jesus Christ. I can prove this very easy.
So these people who apparently had the true beliefs of Jesus Christ, or at least the Quranic narrative, apparently affirmed that. Well, some of them at least rejected the virgin birth, and you get that from Origin. Apparently,
Origin Eusebius say they did accept the virgin birth. Right here, I put in such a.
Did they write about them?
Yeah, right here. I put in such a. So New Catholic Encyclopedia.
Let's say the rest of this for the cross exams. Just start the cross exams real quick.
Can we read this real quick? Origin is the first to mark a distinction between two classes of Ebionites, a distinction which Eusebius also gives in Ecclesiastical History. Some Ebionites accept, but others reject his virginal birth of Christ, though all reject his pre-existence and his divinity, and they weren't Gnostics. They affirmed the prophetic Messiah. This is in Justin Martyr's writings as well. Dialogue of Trifle, he appeals to the Ebionites, and he says that, yes, these people are affirming a prophetic Messiah. And like he's saying, like, why are you affirming a divinic Messiah? Dialogue with Trifle, Justin Martyr. So they did affirm a prophetic Christ, not a divinic Christ. They didn't say he had some spiritual angelic body. This is false. This is the monophysites and the Docetists that come within the 2nd century. Adoptionism comes in the 2nd century. 1st century, they would have affirmed the virginal birth of Christ. Very simple. All right, let's get into the Q&A if you'd like.
Here, Abdulaziz, everyone look in the side chat. Whenever you're gonna use quotes now, make sure to put them in scans or whatever you want to do so people can see them. Abdulaziz, you'll have 8 minutes to do your cross exams. Basically, you will be asking him questions. It'll be like a dialogue where you'd ask him questions. He'll have to respond. But let's try not to stick on the same point for the entire time because it'll get boring. Let's just try to go through each point you have, inshallah. And then after you're done, Luciano will do the same thing, and then we'll go to conclusions, inshallah.
Sounds good. Okay. First point I want to bring up to ruin the gospel narrative. Okay, in John chapter 19, verse 28 to 29, right? The crucified victim, he calls out and he says, I'm thirsty. And then he drinks, so they bring a cup of wine to him and he drinks it and he receives it, right? Was this Jesus?
Yeah.
Okay, so Matthew chapter 26, verse 29 says that Jesus will not drink of the vine until he's back in the heavens. Commentator right here, C.K. Barrett, right? Very prominent, biblical scholar. He tells us that there's no point in reconciling this, right? And that John wasn't aware of this tradition. John wasn't aware of this prophecy because it's not mentioned in John chapter 6, verse 60 with the Eucharist, where he says, I will not drink of the vine until I'm back in the heavens, right? And right here, we would see that the crucified victim is drinking wine. So this would flunk Jesus' prophecy of him saying that I will not drink wine until I'm back in the heavens. How do you address this?
Where does he wait? He will not drink wine until he's back in the heavens.
Matthew chapter 26, verse 29. And Luke chapter 22, verse 17, Luke chapter 22, verse 18. He says, For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until the kingdom of God comes. But in the Gospel of John, it says he received it. But after this, Jesus knowingly...
What does Matthew say about the fruit of the vine, though?
Yeah, Matthew chapter 26, verse 29.
No, but what exactly is it? Like,
he's saying, I will not drink of the wine.
I know he said that, but the thing is, in the Gospels, they use a lot of metaphorical language. So what is he exactly referring to? Because if he's just saying Jesus won't drink any wine until he goes back to heaven, That's kind of dumb.
This is literally word for word what he's saying. All right, I'm going to bring you C.K. Barrett's commentary in the side chat if you'd like to look at it. Right here.
I
1 second.
don't know.
Where he says there's no point in reconciling this. There's no
What's
point
the
in
verse? What's the
reconciling
verse? What's the verse?
John chapter 19, verse 28, 29, and
No,
Matthew
I'm
chapter
talking about
26.
Matthew. I'm
Yeah,
talking about
Matthew chapter
Matthew.
26. Matthew chapter 26, verse 29. Okay.
Matthew
And here's
chapter
C.K. Barrett's.
6,
C.K. Barrett's a
verse
Christian as
20.
well. And the only way you escape this is if you go with like what we find in like the second great treatise of Seth, where it says that Jesus, even like they make mention of it, where Jesus says, "It was not I who drank the vinegar; it was not I who drank the wine, right? But rather a man named Cyrenius."
Hold on. Matthew chapter 6, 29 to 32.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
bad. I got kicked out for some reason.
Matthew chapter 6, 29 and 32.
Matthew chapter 26, verse 29.
Wait.
Can we pause the timer while he looks for it, real quick?
I would tell you I will not drink from. Okay, let me read the context.
Yeah, sure. We can take as much time as we want.
Okay, yeah, fine. And this is the Gospel according to St. John. While you're looking at it, I'm going to read
And
the
even
C.K. Barrett.
Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very sad and began to say to him one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, for all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many of the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from the fruit of the vine, from now until the day when I drink it new with you in the Father's kingdom." So
Okay. So Jesus
he's
makes a
kind of referring to
prophecy.
the He's
Yeah, Jesus
referring
makes
to
a
the
prophecy right
Eucharist.
here. Yeah, he's referring to the Eucharist,
He's
and he's
not
also telling
actually.
people that he will not drink.
He's not literally referring to tasting wine. He's making a prophecy of the Eucharist.
He's telling his people that he will not drink of the vine. It's very clear. He will not drink of the vine until he's back in the heavens, right? And Matthew doesn't mention this, that he drank from the vine. They say they bring the cup to him and he didn't receive it, right? John says he did receive it, right? And right here, this is C.K. Barrett. He says there is no point in trying to harmonize this passage with Jesus' Last Supper promise, not recorded by John. So he's saying like John doesn't get his information from Matthew. Obviously, John is like an independent gospel, right? Not recorded by John to drink no more wine until he should drink it in the kingdom of God. The only way to rationalize this is the second treatise of Great Seth, where it says, where Jesus right here is apparently speaking, "It was another, their father, who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was not I. It was not I." Right? And they struck me with the reed. It was another, Simon, who bore the cross on his shoulder. I was another, upon whom they placed the crown of thorns. But I was rejoicing in the height over all the wealth of the archons and the offspring of their error, of their empty glory, and I was laughing at their ignorance. This is a clear P and not P.
Okay, look, so you can refer from the context that he's talking about the Eucharist, right?
Yeah, he's
Do
talking
you
about
from
Eucharist, and he's telling the people that he will not drink of the vine until he's
okay?
back in heaven.
What does
It's
he
a clear
say?
statement.
What does he say? But before verse 29.
Matthew chapter 26. Oh, look, everyone read Matthew chapter 26, verse 29. Right here.
Yeah, what does he
I
say
tell
before
you, I
that?
shall not drink again of this fruit. He's talking
No,
about
not what the verse says. The verse before that.
the verse before that. Yeah, I know. He's talking about the Eucharist. He's telling you, like, eat my flesh. This is the bread. Drink my
Okay,
blood.
this
This is the
is the
wine. Right?
blood
And
of
he
the
says, I tell you.
covenant, which is poured out for many for
Okay,
forgiveness
can you
of
tell me?
sins.
Can you tell me? Can you tell me what it
Drink
means?
from
Can
the
you tell me?
fruit
Oh,
of
yeah,
the vine.
so CK Barrett. So CK Barrett, like he's a retard. Like he doesn't know what he's talking about. And right here,
He will not
like
hold
obviously
this
Matthew.
feast until he's back in heaven. Bro, who is
Okay,
CK? Who?
CK Barrett. You don't know who CK Barrett is? CK
No,
Barrett.
who's
He's
that?
a Protestant, so you might not be in line with him. But yeah, like
Okay,
obviously he doesn't
I
hold
don't
the
care
one
if he's
hand.
a Protestant. I don't care about
Okay,
that
well, yeah, well, this is a
because he
scholarly source that mentions this, and you're
unsubstantiated.
coming up with an interpretation that you got out of your ass. Okay, anyways, you're not gonna address the contradiction. He says, I will not drink of the vine until I'm back in the heavens." But the one who was on the cross drank from the vine, drank wine. He got thirsty, and then they gave him wine, and then he put his head down. He's like, "Okay, I'm done." All right, okay, let's just move on to the next question so we don't stick
Well,
on to
it
one
was
topic.
he wasn't really drinking. Okay, yeah,
He did drink it. He did drink it. Read the Greek in John chapter 19, verse 28, 29. Very simple.
I know.
Okay,
He offered him to a sponge, but it wasn't the same. He's obviously referring to the Eucharist. He's referring to the blood of Christ. He's referring to that specific way where they give that mass. So he says, "I will have this with you when in my Father's kingdom."
Okay. Anyways, like I don't think that's an adjustment of the contradiction, but let's move on. Okay, I'm gonna go into John right now. John, why was John revising and inserting and omitting details to strengthen the idea of it being Jesus of Nazareth? So John in his gospel, right, differs from the synoptic tradition in regards to what was written on top of the cross, in regards to who was there, and in regards to Simon of Cyrene bearing the cross or not. Okay, so three instances where John completely contradicts the other disciples and their synoptics on this. Right, so the other disciples within their gospels, they say it was written on top of the King of the Jews, Jesus, the King of the Jews. Right, John specifies and says it was Jesus of Nazareth. Right, so this is a very good distinction, and because we know there was Jesus Barabbas on the cross, Jesus Son of the Father, right, and then there was two Jesus, and there was women witnessing according to the synoptic tradition. There was women witnessing it from afar according to Matthew and Mark. There was women witnessing it afar. John inserts the beloved disciple watching Jesus being crucified, and he inserts that the honing in on Jesus of Nazareth, so there was no confusion between Jesus Barabbas and Jesus of Nazareth, and he omits the story, clear P and not P. He omits the story of Simon of Cyrene bearing the cross, and Raymond E. Brown says that in his book, right here, his book, The Death of the Messiah, page 912, he talks about how scholars assume and scholars say that John was aware of the Simonian tradition. John, prior to the Gospel of John, there was a Simonian tradition saying that Simon of Cyrene was crucified instead, and that John omits this story to therefore repel any shubhat that the Christians would have had, therefore solidifying that, yes, there was a disciple witnessing Jesus being crucified. Yes, there was Jesus of Nazareth. There's no way we can confuse it with Jesus, Son of the Father, Jesus of Barabbas. And yes, Simon of Cyrene didn't bear the cross, but it was John. It was Jesus himself who went and bore his cross, and he's the one who was crucified, and he's the one who was taken to Golgotha. Can you address to me why John is a revisionist and why John is trying to refute all these doubts that the Christians are having within the first century in regards to the crucifixion, please?
Okay, so in the Christian tradition, Simon of Cyrene did bear the cross, but it was to help Jesus carry it to the hill, right?
Not according to John. John chapter 19, verse 17.
Because he didn't. Even if he didn't omit it, this is like the stuff Ehrman makes. When he says like,
this is Raymond Brown.
Luke
This is
didn't.
Catholic scholar who brings up this point. Right here, clear P and not P. Who bore the cross? You want me to show you his writings? I can show you his writings. Simonian tradition, inside chat, I'm going to put it.
What's your point exactly?
My point is that John is a revisionist. So John knows that there's doubts going around about the crucifixion, saying, oh, like people were probably saying, oh, there was only two women at witnessing it. There wasn't a beloved disciple there. So John inserts the story of beloved disciple. The other commentators, the gospels don't make mention of this, that the beloved disciple was there witnessing the crucifixion. He also hones in on Jesus of Nazareth being specified.
Brother, I asked.
Yeah, my point is pretty simple. John is a revisionist. John is over here trying to reveal that.
Wait, you're saying John is a revisionist? You're saying he's revising what the other gospels have said, but
exactly.
What's your point regarding
the belief in the crucifixion? To strengthen the belief in regards to the crucifixion. Why is he contradicting the other synoptics?
You're saying that he's not omitting the fact that Simon of Cyrene carried the cross.
He omits this, right? And the scholar right here on the side chat, right? Raymond E. Brown, right here, he talks about, and this approach depends on the force of the dative. Okay, right here, I'm going to read. Similar use of heto, okay, as the martyr takes the closest. Why would John so firmly reject Simon's role in favor of Jesus carrying his own cross? Some think that this above mentioned is the Gnostic view denounced by Irenaeus. So right here, that John, he says that some think that the above mentioned is the Gnostic view denounced by Irenaeus, was already in circulation, and John was refuting it. So we know of a Simonian tradition where Simon of Cyrene, where people were proclaiming Simon of Cyrene was crucified prior to the Gospel of John being written. So this is why the Gospel of John omits this detail, right? So the people don't have any of this confusion, whereas Simon of Cyrene was the one who's taken Golgotha. And even if you read it within the original Greek from Mark chapter 15, from 20 to 22, it'll read like Jesus. It'll read like Simon of Cyrene was crucified instead of Jesus. And they inserted Jesus' name in there when it's not in the original Greek. So can you tell me why John is revising this Gospel, and why is he trying to repel all the doubts and the crucifixion that the people had within the first century? This is prior to the Gospel of John being composed, that people are having doubts, that people are arguing against the crucifixion, saying Simon of Cyrene was crucified instead.
So you're essentially saying because John doesn't mention Simon of Cyrene bearing the cross, he's trying to clear the doubts of those who believe Simon of Cyrene was the one who was crucified?
Yes.
Well, yeah, you have the Simonians who are inherently Gnostic, but he did that because the reason a lot of people because if you look at the Gospels, like this is a common argument brought by like people like Ehrman and stuff. They're saying, why did this Gospel omit this, but this Gospel didn't omit that? Because
I give you three instances. Listen, I give you three instances where he's omitting certain details and he's inserting certain details, like the beloved disciple, like Jesus of Nazareth, specifying Jesus of Nazareth, where he's trying to prove the crucifixion.
Let's do this. I didn't want to cut in too much, but let's just do this, Abdulaziz. Finish the point with like in 1-2 sentences your question or whatever it may be. Once Lucerna answers, then we'll move on.
It's not that. I just don't because I'm trying to figure out his point. He just kind of
All right.
restating the entire point from the beginning.
Try to condense it a little bit into 1 to 2 sentences, and then Luciano will respond.
Okay, look.
Do you
You're saying
believe that the okay,
John
do you
emits
believe the
certain stuff.
Simon? I
John
can hold
emits
it
certain
down
stuff.
to a simple question. I can make it into a simple question. Do you believe the Simonian tradition existed prior to the Gospel of John being written?
I don't know. I'm not educated on it.
All right. Oh, that's fine.
It
You can look
doesn't
into
really.
the Simonian tradition. So the Simonian tradition is Simon Cyrene was crucified and said this is prior. This tradition is prior to the
Yeah,
Gospel of
I
John
know what
being
the
written.
Simonian tradition is. Like the
Okay.
Basilidians were also Simonian.
All right. Luciano, are you ready for your cross exam?
Yeah, this is probably going to be very short.
All right. Go ahead, start.
So, you know what the historical method is?
Yeah, the historical critical method. Yeah, whether they're going to go by attestation, whether they're going to go over the reliability of these sources. It depends on the historical critical method. If they're going to
Brother,
go from a
I just asked if you know what the historical method is.
yeah, I'm explaining it to you so we can agree on our definition.
Okay, can you try to prove the Quranic narrative using the historical method?
The Quran doesn't fall into the category of historicity. It falls into the category of theology. I'm not using the Quran as a historical document. I'm telling you that the
I'm talking about
Quran,
the Quranic
surprisingly
narrative.
enough,
I'm talking about the Quranic narrative of the crucifixion because that's kind of what the entire point of this debate was. If
yeah.
Jesus Christ
So
was replaced by a substitution on the cross and was ascended into heaven.
yeah, I can explain to you. Okay. I'm going to explain to you what the Quranic narrative says. I can read the verses for you real quick. I'm going to make this quick so I can use your time.
Sure, explain the Quranic narrative.
Yeah. Okay. Give me 1 second. All right, here. And for they're saying we have killed Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of God. In fact, they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it appeared to them as if they did. Indeed, those who differ about him are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it except following the assumptions. Certainly, they did not kill him. Right? I can read in Arabic if you'd like. But the Quran is basically telling us the early people had ikhtilaf. They had difference of opinion in regards to what happened to Jesus in regards to the crucifixion. It's specified in the verse. Then we were told that there was shak, that there was doubt, that people were having doubts in regards to what, and I proved this. I just proved this with my last question. Then we're told that they did not have ilm, they did not have knowledge, and the info wasn't coming from reliable sources. And last, we're told that they ended up following dhan, conjecture, hearsay, and I just showed you, right? 18 different documents, 10 of them denying the crucifixion. Within the first century, we have the Simonian tradition, we have all these Jewish Christian groups rejecting the crucifix. We have Paul and his Christology and his soteriology and his theology and contingent upon Jesus' crucifixion, right? So we see all these differences of opinion, all this ikhtilaf, all this dhan, all this conjecture, all this hearsay is there within the first century, second century, and Jewish Christianity is the majority within the first century. That shows the Hawarian were prevailing. Yeah, this
Okay,
is how we
so
understand.
essentially the Quranic. Where I asked you to explain the Quranic narrative and you explain what happened in the first century, but essentially
I
the
read
Quranic
the
narrative.
Quranic narrative, and I'm
Jesus.
telling
No,
you
no,
how.
hold on.
Go ahead.
So essentially, the Quranic narrative is that Jesus Christ was raised up to heaven, right? And then people down on earth had like little doubts and stuff about what actually happened to him, right?
Okay, no. So I can go by tafsir, or I can go from Ibn Abbas, where he tells us that Jesus' apostles and disciples would have known that he wasn't crucified, would have known that he was ascended into the heavens, and they would have known. It would have been the Jews who went and crucified Jesus. They would have been the ones who were saying, "Oh yeah, we killed him," boasting and making a mockery of him, saying that we killed him. But the true, authentic disciples of Christ wouldn't have been accepting vicarious atonement. They wouldn't have been propagating this view that Jesus died for the sins of humanity, and they wouldn't even went propagating the idea that Jesus was crucified. And I showed you sources from the first century: Ignatius, a letter to the Trallians, letter to the Philadelphians, letter to
Okay, so
Magnesians.
that's your view, right?
Paul's conjecture as well. You said what?
That's your view, right?
That's my
Okay,
view.
let me sum up your view. Your view is that Christ ascended to heaven. He appeared crucified to a specific faction of Jews, presumably the Pharisees. Did he appear crucified to the Romans as well?
Did he appear like that to the Romans as well?
Yeah.
Is that what you said? Well, the Quranic narrative,
Yeah.
if I'm taking it, depends on which tafsir I'm taking
Bro,
from.
just say yes or no, bro.
The Romans, I'm saying it depends. I'm saying from our tradition, from our belief, we wouldn't say that the Romans are the ones who killed Jesus, right? Paul doesn't believe the Romans killed Jesus. Paul in First Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14, 15 says the Jews are the ones who killed Jesus, and even says in Romans chapter 7, he says the Roman authority can never do any wrong because they're inspired by God, right? So he doesn't even believe that the Romans went and put Jesus on the cross. He doesn't believe this. This is one of my arguments that I was making in the first opening statement. So yes, it was the Jews who killed Jesus, or
Okay,
quote
so
unquote
only
killed Jesus.
the Jews conducted the entire crucifixion, right?
Yes, the Jews are the ones who persecuted, and the Jews are the ones who plotted, according to John chapter 11, verse 45 to 48. According to
Yeah,
the Quran,
brother, I know. Okay, they conducted they conducted it, like they
yeah,
actually
they
dragged.
could have had they could have had people around their view, trying to make them work for them. But yeah, we know
Okay.
the
So
Jews are
that's
the
your
ones.
view, right? That's your
Yeah,
view.
yeah,
Okay, and then your view is that Christ ascended to heaven. He appeared
yeah.
crucified to these people. It was probably Simon of Cyrene, Judas, an apostle, the Roman soldier, whoever you believe it was substituted on the cross. So you believe Christ ascended to heaven, and then everyone. So he only appeared crucified to these Pharisees, and then the disciples knew the actual view, and they went telling everyone that, oh, Jesus Christ was not crucified, right?
Exactly. Yes. But رفع الله إليه وكان الله عزيزا حكيما.
Who
And
are these?
Allah,
Wait, who are these disciples? Who are these
for these
disciples?
disciples, I would consider James, right? And I can bring you scholars like Hans Joachim Schoeps. I can give you Jeffrey J. Butts. I can give you from James D. Tabor as well, that identifies like the Ebionites and the Nazarenes who were followers under James the Just, and I can show you where they rejected, where he talks about them in their writings, and where they said they rejected the vicarious atonement, they rejected the resurrection, they didn't have it in their original writings, they make no mention of the passion and crucifixion narrative, right, and the resurrection narrative, which most scholars will say are later on additions, and these would be the Hawariyun, these would be the people that identify that where Jesus is authentic disciples. James, I would consider one of them if you want. Peter, right, depending on the historical Peter, right, we have writings attributed to Peter where he rejects the crucifixion, like the Apocalypse of Peter. We have writings attributed to Peter where he calls Paul an enemy of God and an apostate from the law, and he rejects his idea of seeing the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. And he says like he makes an argument where he says Paul or Jesus wouldn't reveal himself in apparitions or dreams, right? He wouldn't do this. He said like we saw the physical body of Christ whenever he was resurrected. This is like your view, and Paul doesn't make mention of this.
Well,
Paul
to be
like
fair,
based on
Paul
an
was an
angelic.
ex-Pharisee, right?
Paul is an ex-Pharisee. There's difference of opinion in regards to what Paul was. Paul, I would classify him as a Sadducee, right? When it comes to him being a Pharisee, he's quoting.
Paul was an
So he's
ex-Pharisee.
quoting.
That's why the Christians are afraid of him.
That's from your view. So like other people will
Paul
put
was
like
an
doubts in
ex-Pharisee.
this. So can you tell me why
The
Paul is
apostle was
quoting
an
Greek?
ex-Pharisee.
Can you tell me why Paul is quoting Greek literature, right? When the Pharisees were known to hate the Greco-Roman influenced literature in Acts chapter 17, verse 28, where he says we are the offspring, and he quotes like a Stoic philosopher that like talking about we are the offspring of Zeus. Can you tell me this?
You're
Like a
laying
Pharisee
out.
would never do this. A Pharisee would never do this. A Pharisee, there's no chance a Pharisee would ever do this. Pharisees despise the Greco-Roman, the Hellenistic Jews, the ones who were influenced by this Greco-Roman school of thought, their paganistic beliefs, ideologies, scripture writings that like all your gospel writers derive their beliefs, their concepts, their customs, their traditions off of these writings as well, like the Homeric writings, for example. Right? And Dennis R. MacDonald makes a lot of arguments for that as well. So yeah, when it comes to our narrative, it's very historically sound. The Quran doesn't fall
Okay.
into a historical document. It's not a historical document. No one regards it as a historical document, but us as Muslims, we believe in it. Anything it tells us about history, we would affirm it. But it's very interestingly enough that we find this belief in the solidified in the foundational beliefs that were within the Quran within the first century. So
I'm not talking about the Quran itself. I'm not talking about the Quran itself because your narrative seems to be that Christ was not crucified. He appeared crucified to the Jews, the disciples, particularly James. James, no.
That he appeared crucified to James. Okay, can you tell me? Can you tell me in
I
James's
said the
writing?
disciples, James. No. I'm not saying he was crucified to James. I'm saying like disciples, James in particular. Is that it? No other disciples had the true message of Jesus Christ?
The Hawariyun aren't identified by name within the Quran. There's a lot of speculations on who these Hawariyun could have been, but we don't need to know the names of Moses and his disciples, of
Okay,
Abraham
so
and
these
his disciples.
disciples went around propagating the view that Jesus Christ was not
Exactly.
crucified.
Yeah.
Wait,
Ibn Hazm
can I have
says,
more time on the cross-exam?
yeah, go ahead. Take all the time you need.
This was just trying to understand his view. Okay, so can you try applying the historical method to this narrative that Christ was not crucified, that the disciple Peter, James went around preaching that he was not crucified.
Beautiful. Okay, so we
And
know Jewish. I can address this point. You wanted to add something else?
also, you're lagging out. You're like hella lagging out.
I'm lagging out. Can you hear me good?
Okay, never mind. Yeah, you're good. Yeah.
Okay. Beautiful. So I already bring you the groups that Paul is in contention with, and the Ebionites and the Nazarenes are identified as followers under James the Just, right? From the years 30 to 80 CE. Your Acts book is a revisionist, and I can bring you multiple scholars like Jeffrey J. Butts, where he talks about how Luke is a revisionist, and Luke always glorifies and exalts Paul, and always acts like he's whitewashing history, and he's sweeping everything under the rug, all the theological disputes, all the contradictions between each person's ideologies and beliefs pertaining to Christ. He goes over this as well, how Luke is whitewashing. Luke mentions Paul over 100 times in Acts. Luke only mentions the head of the church, which I would identify James as the head of the church from the years 30 to 80 CE, the Church of Jerusalem, right? He only mentions James 3 times. He mentions Paul over 100 times. So yeah, and we see early disputes. I can prove to you how James is a Jewish Christian, right? From using Acts chapter 21, verse 18 through 24, where he makes Paul retake the Nazirite vow, right? And the Nazarenes, right, who Epiphanius says is the earliest Christians, and they would be identified as the earliest Christians according to the book of Acts. They are the ones who are affirming the prophetic Messiah, not a divinic Messiah. They're the ones, right, for that we have from their writings that are saying that the Old Testament is corrupted. They are the ones who did hold to the virgin birth. They are the ones who believe the scriptures of the Old Testament were tainted. They rejected substitution atonement or blood sacrifices, and they contested the crucifixion in the time of Paul. They were followers of John the Baptist, then Jesus, then James, and I can show you how all of their beliefs and everything that they do, like how they sell up all their belongings and they go and they preach basically what the same message as Christ, that their beliefs were held really early in the primitive church. Right? The development of the Trinity, the development of the hypostatic union, this development of this mythological man God coming down and saving us. This is all coming from Paul. It's not coming from the Jewish Christians. And the Jewish Christians, I believe that they even planned to kill him. The Jewish Christians in Acts chapter 24, there was 40 of these Jews who were planning to kill Paul because Paul was teaching against the law. Paul was teaching against the law. He couldn't uphold the law himself. He struggled with it, and he was trying to deviate and go away from it. So yes, the Jewish Christians were in line with Islamic thought. They weren't accepting the crucifixion. They weren't accepting the resurrection. None of their writings. Bring me any writings from these Jewish Christians. Gospel of the Ebionites, the Nazarenes, the Didache, anything that like the Gospel, even Q or one of the early
Gospel of the
sources.
Ebionites
Bring
is
me the passion and
lost.
crucifixion narrative with them.
Bro, okay, look. First of all, half these gospels like lost. Like the Gospel of the Ebionites, nobody even has that anymore. That got lost a long time ago.
No,
But
we
can you
do
fill in
have it. We do have
answer
it.
my
We do have it
question?
in secret Clementine.
Can you
We
apply
do
the
have a lot.
historical? Can you apply the historical method? Can you apply historical method? Wait, can you cite the historical method, step by step?
I told you the historical method is going to be dealing with like attestation. It's going to be dealing with people claiming in regards to certain events happening. It's going to be going by any corroboration to these historical events or these historical figures in their life and their ministry. It's going to be like taking all of this into account. Historical critical method. But you're looking at it, if you're looking at it from like a naturalistic perspective, that's different than a theological perspective as well. Because from a theological perspective, we both believe that Jesus could do miracles, that Jesus could have been ascended into the heavens. You believe in the resurrection. I believe him ascending into the heavens
Yeah,
prior.
I know the Quran accounts of theological. Bro, I know the Quran accounts of theological event. That doesn't mean that it can't be historically attested to. For example, the resurrection. A lot of people argue with historical attestation to the resurrection. That's a different topic. But even if Christ had ascended, or as you say, you still have to provide the kind of historical attestation that there were Christians who kind of held to the Quranic narrative, because a lot of the Jewish Christians that you cite have very weird views. Like there's a lot of stuff that goes against the Quran as well. So I
No, they
wouldn't
don't.
say these people
Later
really.
on, there's factions that split and they do affirm like some weird beliefs. And I told you the adoptionist Christology comes within the 2nd century. So prior to that, even Eusebius and Origen say yes, the Ebionites and then their time were affirming the virgin birth. Right. That's
All right,
one way to
Along
do it.
Burn, he
three
said
minutes. 2 minutes left.
Origin. From what you cited, you said some rejected, some didn't.
Yeah, I told you. So we're talking about
And
adoptionist Christology
they
there.
also had the tradition of this vegetarianism, rejecting animal
Vegetarianism, fourth
sacrifice.
century, fourth
They
century,
kind of.
fourth century. This is Epiphanius' writing.
What
So
do you mean?
Epiphanius, the Ebionites are the Jewish
They weren't
Christians
even.
that Epiphanius is
They
dealing with.
died out before the 2nd century, though.
No, the Ebionites didn't.
The
The
Ebionites were.
Ebionites were.
The,
So why is Epiphanius speaking about them? Epiphanius of Salamis. He speaks on them. He says they were
he
going
could
by
have
a
been
redacted
recounting.
version of the
He could
Gospel
have
of
been recounting
Matthew.
history.
I'm rewriting
He
history.
could
I'm
have been
quoting
recounting
Epiphanius.
history.
So Epiphanius is wrong when he
I'm not saying
deals
he's
with certain Jewish Christians.
like you're recounting history, but the Ebionites, for the most part, had died out by the 2nd century.
Okay. The Ebionites, the
That's why
Nazarenes, we know
there's
the
no. If
Nazarene
they
and
actually lived that
Salman
long,
bin
there would
Farsi.
probably be. Like,
Okay. So I can quote you Epiphanius as well, where he talks about people reading the Apocalypse of Peter within the fifth
what?
century. I can quote you Salman bin Farsi, right, who we have from our Islamic literature, who's a Nazarene, who wasn't in line with his Trinitarian belief, wasn't in line with Jesus dying for the sins, and he saw the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was waiting in Medina for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and recognized him as a true prophet. So we do see like they dispersed. Yes, they were
Wait,
heavily persecuted. Yes, Paul's Christology, Paul's soteriology, and Paul's theology remained or started thriving and caught fire. Right, we see this, right? But when it comes to the Jewish Christian groups, they were under the rug basically. But yeah, we still have their remnants. We still have church fathers quoting them. I was appealing to church fathers. I was appealing to Ignatius of Antioch, who on three different occasions he's refuting Jewish Christians and their belief, where they're saying it's not an original doctrine.
but
So why would he
most.
affirm Jesus being crucified? Why would he only appeared to suffer, right?
All right.
And he says that some reject his death. Some reject his death, and he says, "I urge you to act like Christ's disciples." This is what he says in the letter to Magnesians.
Let's do this, Lucerna. We're gonna do the same thing. Just ask either shorten or ask a new question, whatever it may be, and then after his response, we'll end it right there. If that's fine with y'all.
Sounds good.
Lucerna, go ahead if you have if you want to condense your question or if you have a question at all.
No, it's good. I'm also lagging a bit. Like he's very choppy.
All right. So do you want to give up the rest of
Yeah,
the
can you hear me?
Okay. So then,
Can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Hello?
That was mad delayed.
We can hear you.
Yo, are you here?
Yeah, we're here.
Yeah, I'm here.
I can hear you. It's just you're a little choppy. But
Okay. So
what did you ask?
Lucerna, I was gonna ask you, um, what's it called? If you want to give up the rest of the time for the cross exam, then we can either do two things. We can go into conclusions, or before conclusions, we can have a Q&A. We can have two Muslims and two Christians come up and ask either one of y'all questions. If not, we can skip that and just do the conclusions and end there. What do y'all think is best?
I'm down for whatever.
You wait. So you said a Q&A or conclusion?
We can do either a Q&A before the conclusion or just skip the Q&A and go to the conclusion. The Q&A would just be two Muslims would come up and ask you a question, Lucerna, and then two Christians would come and ask Abdulaziz a question, and you guys would pick the Muslim and Christian.
I do have a friend that I could bring up, but I think he's offline. Hold on.
We can start with
Hold on.
Abdulaziz's picks, then I guess people asking you questions
We
if you
can
want.
skip the
Yeah,
Q&A
bro.
if you don't want.
I have no one to bring this. At no point,
There are some people in the comments who would want to come up, like 009 and other people as well. If you're down
Brother,
for
half of these people are like trolls.
it. So you want to skip that or you want to do that?
I kind of want to do it. It's just I don't know anyone. Wait, hold on. This guy TM me.
Alright.
Okay. Yeah, let's just skip to the conclusion because I don't have anyone to bring up, and half the Christians here are like trolls.
No problem.
Here, do you
Unless
want
anyone.
I can want to bring
Okay. Okay, bring up Rumi then.
Alright, let's start Abdulaziz with Rumi if you have a question. Do you have a question, Rumi? Alright, Rumi request up. We'll start with Rumi's question.
And
Who's the question for?
He'll have a question for Abdulaziz.
Okay.
And then we have Yazan. I believe that he has a question for the Christian debater.
We'll have Abdulaziz pick the person who goes, but Rumi.
Leafy for the first.
All right, Rumi, go ahead and ask your question to Abdulaziz.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, what's up, Rumi?
Yeah, we can.
I'm good, thank you. You earlier in your opening statement, you said that by consensus, the Gospels are anonymous, right? And one of the persons you quoted was Mike Lacuna. And in his recent article called "Are the Gospels Historically Reliable?" a focused comparison on the Augustus and the Gospel of Mark, he says on page 8 of 18, he says, over the past 50 years, a majority of critical scholars agree with the traditional authorship of Mark, that his son, named Mark or John Mark, wrote that he remembered the Apostle Peter said. Also, a large majority of critical scholars during the same period date Mark Gospel as 50 to 70. And this was a survey of over 75 critical scholars. How do you deal with this, even though your opening statement said to the contrary?
Yeah, Rumi, I didn't bring up Mike Lacuna in regards to him negating the reliability on the.
Yeah, I didn't say you did, but you brought him up as a scholar, right?
Yeah.
So I'm asking, how do you deal with one of your scholars that you brought up, not for this particular point, but one of your scholars in general brings that you brought up that says that the majority of actual critical scholars agree that the Gospels are not anonymous?
Then I would say that the attestation to this gospel that we can earliest find is from Irenaeus of Lyons, which comes in the year 180, which it doesn't really do much for us. We know that these gospels would have been named.
Do you concede to the point that actually critical scholars do think the Gospels are not anonymous?
That the Gospels, I would say the majority academic consensus is that the Gospels are anonymous. And right here, I bring from Edward Schweizer.
That says the opposite to you. And I can bring many scholars that say the opposite to you.
Well, great. Then we can go scholar for scholar. But I bring here from the Good News according to Mark, Edward Schweizer, and I trust the European scholarship over some American evangelical scholarship, right?
Okay,
he says, we do not know what the
why is European better than American? Can you give me the justification for this?
All right, so when it comes to European scholarship, I think it's a lot more advanced, especially with the Germans.
You thinking is not an argument. Like,
okay, I would say.
Okay, this is becoming a debate. Rumi, just real quick, say your question one more time, then I'll drop.
Oh yeah, so I don't think he can give a sufficient answer. The question was that what's your opinion on Mike Lacuna, who says that most critical scholars say that the Gospels are anonymous, and his answer was, Irenaeus is the earliest, which is disputed.
All
So
right.
Irenaeus is the earliest that who quotes the four gospels and who says that these are the ones that are doctrified, these are the ones that codified. Right? When it comes to the Gospel of Mark, I made my statement very clear earlier. This is the Good News According to Mark by Edward Schweizer. He says we do not know who the author was. Conceivable that Mark was his real name. The superscriptions of the biblical books were not added until the 2nd century, but it was necessary, at least orally, to distinguish between the Gospels. As soon there was more than one. If the title had been given at a later time, the real author was not known. Okay, but in regards to if you want to attribute the Gospel of Mark, I think Mark is a very excellent writer. I think Mark used literary mimesis in regards to the Homeric writings, and yeah, we can go over the academic consensus in regards like we can go to Dennis or McDonald has multiple books on this where Mark is literally verbatim copying off of using Homeric literary mimesis, and he's copying off the Homeric writings using it as the backbone of his scripture. This would have been in his time, and that he is also using like Old Testament prophecies as well to dictate and to narrate the crucifixion and resurrection or the crucifixion site. And he quotes like Psalms 22. Robert M. Price makes this point. Bartman makes this point that he's literally just giving Psalms 22. He's not a historical witness. He's not an attestation. And according to Eusebius, right, Mark is an interpreter of Peter, right? According to ecclesiastical history, Mark wasn't there witnessing Jesus's life events, witnessing Jesus's ministry, witnessing Jesus's practices and teachings. He wasn't there. He was an interpreter of Peter, right? So
All
when
right.
it comes to like the whole idea that Mark is like a surefire source in regards to proving the crucifixion, yeah, there's a lot of issues I can point out with this. Even then, yeah, there's not much more I can say.
Thank you for the answer, and thank you, Amir, for the question. Abdulaziz, who do you pick for your who do you pick to for the question against Lucerna? There's Abdul Yazan, Abu Damdam, Leafy was here, Shaky
Leafy,
Bakey,
Leafy,
Shaky Bay,
Leafy wants to come up. Leafy wants to come up.
Leafy. Okay, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
My question for you, Lucana. So, in your opening statement, you said you had three types of sources for your belief in the crucifixion. You said you had eyewitness testimony, you had secondhand testimony, and then you had an oral tradition, right? So, my question
No.
is to you is that's what you said. It's recorded. You can check it later.
Well,
My
I
question to you is, can you name?
testimony.
I haven't finished asking my question, bro. My question to you is, can you name me a single eyewitness who is trustworthy, who actually saw Christ being crucified? And if you name someone from the Gospels, I'm just gonna laugh at you. Go ahead.
All right,
Brother,
thank you.
I said eyewitnesses threefold, but I said we do have the synoptics as eyewitnesses, but I said it's inadmissible because you guys criticize them heavily, so I said I wouldn't bring it up. That's what I
Who's
said.
eyewitness? Mark was an
But
interpreter of Peter. Mark wasn't witnessing this. Matthew wasn't witnessing this as well. Right? Matthew was like Luke as well. Luke is a historian. He wasn't witnessing these events. These people weren't disciples of Jesus, watching his ministry, watching his life events. John would be the one that you would go to, but then again, like I refuted the Johannine tradition, right? That leads back to the John son of Zebedee, and then we have John the son of Zebedee, John the elder, John the apostle of the Johannine community, or an anonymous disciple that where this gospel is attributed to, and John doesn't even make reference to who's writing this gospel. So we have
All right.
literally no one from these gospels.
All right. Okay. Lucerna, do you have another question? Do you want to bring up to ask a question of Aziz? There's 009 still waiting if you want to bring him up, but I don't know if you know him.
I don't know him, and he doesn't look very genuine. Yeah, this guy Sanctum want to come up?
Sanctum, do you want to come up?
Or you can ask the question in the chat and you can answer it. Right? It was just a Q&A. Like, you just bring this guy 009 up then. Who cares?
All right. 009, come up and ask your question, inshallah.
Alex 009.
Yo, what's up? Can you hear me?
What's good? What's good?
What's up? So my question for you, well, of course, it's gonna revolve around like the Old Testament prophecies. I asked you this before, but I can't really like remember your answer. So, my question is this: if I were to argue for the suffering servant being the Messiah, and of course I would argue like using like the descriptions given in the suffering servant songs, and then compare them with the passage discussing the Messiah. So the argument I gave you last time was this: in Isaiah 11, for example, it says that the Messiah will have the Lord's Spirit upon him. This is the same description given the suffering servant in I believe it's Isaiah 42. And Isaiah 53, of course, it uses it says that the servant will be cut off the land of the living for the transgressions of others, which is the same description given to the anointed one in Daniel. It says he will be cut off. So this is just like these are like basic arguments for the suffering servant being the Messiah. And of course, like there are lots of arguments for Zechariah 12, with the angel of the Lord in Zechariah 12:8, because you know,
Yeah.
2 verses later it says that he'll be pierced, etc., etc. So I wanted to know, like, how would you reconcile this with your position?
Beautiful. So historically, this wouldn't fall in line with anything that we see pertaining to Jesus's crucifixion, Jesus' life, Jesus' ministry. Correlate that to the Jewish idea of their Messiah. The Messiah was supposed to come. He was supposed to reign on earth. He was supposed to establish peace from the east to the west of the earth. He was supposed to take the throne of David, right? He was supposed to die. Like, there is opinions, yeah, that he was supposed to die as a martyr, right? Daniel chapter 7 through Daniel chapter 11 will give you this view that he was supposed to die as a martyr, but that is martyrdom, dying in the battle, right? So when it comes to I said, like, when it comes to this, these messianic prophecies pertaining to Jesus' crucifixion, there's a lot of things that have no backing in regards to the suffering servant. Suffering servant, I told you like multiple times. Suffering servant. First of all, there's a strong difference between the Jewish belief being redemptive suffering and the Christian belief being a substitution, vicarious atonement. Right? The Christian's belief is literally paganism. It's literally paganism. Child sacrifice, man sacrifice, innocent sacrifice. This completely goes against the Old Testament. So for anyone to think and to interpret Isaiah 53 or any of these prophecies as a mythological man, God, savior who's going to come and he's going to die for the sins of humanity, this is absurd, right? And basically, like how the Jews understand this is how a particular interpretation of the Midrash cannot override the central teaching, the Peshat, right? Well, when it comes to the Jewish interpretation, they will either identify the servant being Jeremiah, right? And there's Isaiah, there's first Isaiah, there's Isaiah, Isaiah 40 through 55 is a different author, right? But when it comes to the poetic language that he's using, it is very emotional and things like this. But I could even say it's referring to Jeremiah. I can say the suffering servant has been identified from Isaiah 41 verse 8, Isaiah 43 verse 10, Isaiah 49 verse 3, and Isaiah 53 is a continuation of this, and it's talking about their exile in Babylon. Right, Cyrus would have been like notified as one of like the redeemers of the children of Israel. He's mentioned as the Messiah, so he's mentioned as the Messiah in Isaiah 45 verse 1, Isaiah 45 verse 1 and verse 2, like God's instrument, the anointed one, the Messiah, Cyrus, king, right, who helps the children of Israel, who helps the suffering servant. And I'll say, yeah, the suffering servant is, according to Isaiah 43 verse 10, the witnesses of Israel, the faction of Israel, who went through this exile, who went through this persecution, who went through this redemptive suffering, and this is all documented within the historical interpretations of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 40 through Isaiah chapter 60 something. Right? I can bring multiple sources in the slide chat if you want to look at them, look at the scholarly interpretations, and look at the arguments they make against Isaiah 53 ever referring to Jesus. I'll put them all in the slide chat if anyone's interested. All right, Shaky Bay, if he wants to come up.
There's Abdul, Shaky Bay, Abu Damdam, and El Ray. Would you want to pick?
Shaky been tagging me hella, so I'm gonna bring up Shaky.
Alright, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Hi.
Okay, so my question for you, Lucerna, is in 1 Timothy 2:5, it says that for there is one God and one mediator between God and men, and the man, Jesus Christ. So how does this fit the concept of the crucifixion if Jesus is also God? Who's the man mediating?
Brother, what? You know the mediator is Jesus Christ, right? If you read the verse. I don't see how it ties into the crucifixion. Because it's like, look. There's the verse was when there's one man so 1 Timothy 2:5. So technically KJV, but I don't really care. But there's one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ. It's not saying that, well, I would affirm that Jesus Christ is God, but in this sense the mediator here is Jesus Christ. I don't know how this contradicts the crucifixion. I don't understand your question.
Should we bring him back up, or is that solid enough to answer?
That's fine.
Okay.
That was okay.
Let's do one more each. Sanctum, did Sanctum send you questions, Lucerna?
Huh?
Did Sanctum send you questions? He said he'd send you a question for Abdulaziz.
Oh, okay. So, okay, he DM'd me. He said, "Sure thing," but okay. What's your question, bro? What is your question?
Okay.
He's not giving me a question.
Sources on Isaiah 53 in the side chat if anyone's interested.
I think that we're wasting time at this point. Can we jump to in the
Conclusion?
conclusion session and closing statements?
All right, we can do that. Yeah. Because you began the debate, Abdulaziz, you can begin with the conclusion. Go ahead.
All right. Very simple. All right. To conclude, wait, how much time is the closing statement? 3 minutes?
Yeah, 3 minutes. I'll
All
start
right,
right
I'll
now.
make it quick.
All right, go ahead.
All right, beautiful. All right. To conclude, like this debate, right? We can see that the Gospels are horrendously unreliable, and there's zero non-Christian witnesses to the crucifixion or attestation in the first century, external to Scripture, pertaining to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Right? There were people in Paul's time heavily rejecting the crucifixion and the soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, from the supposed crucifix. We have many different groups claiming many different things pertaining to Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Many denying it as well, and others claiming he died by different methods. Even I didn't bring this up, but even the Jews say he died by way of stoning in Psalm 143a verse 20. Right? So this is like a whole plethora of theories in regards to is it divine rapture, is it substitution, was he saved, was he tied to the cross, or was he pierced? Did he ascend into the heavens? Right? Like a lot of people with a lot of different theories pertaining to Jesus Christ. Exactly what we see in the Quran. So the Quran is perfectly in line with the events of the crucifixion. So alhamdulillah, we have the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam who comes and reveals to us the true message of Isa alayhi salam and his disciples, and is a continuation of the prophets, leading back from Jesus, leading back to Moses, leading back to Abraham, with a consistent message, right? That no man can die for the sins of another. That Hero Israel, Lord is one. Qul huwa Allahu ahad, right? Yeah, and all these different beliefs. I was gonna go into like there's no physical evidence of Jesus' crucifix as well, right? But we don't really have time for that. The shroud of Turin, the nails, the true cross, the crown of thorns. This is like a funny claim that the Christians make that we have archaeological evidence or any material evidence of Jesus' crucifix, and just a bunch of nonsense that they try to bring as well, right? What else? What else? And I was gonna bring up these arguments as well. But to conclude, yeah, we saw like a lot of paganistic beliefs being infiltrated into these gospels. The quote from Justin Martyr as well, the Homeric writings basically being the basis of Mark's gospel, according to Dennis R. MacDonald, according to a lot of scholars as well. Right? What else? What else could I go over? Okay. I think I showed him pretty well that the Jewish Christians within the first century, right? They would have rejected. They wouldn't have any gospel. They wouldn't have had anything in their writings pertaining to the crucifixion and the resurrection. Right? They would have been rejecting the crucifix in the time of Paul. I bring you two scholars that note this. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23, the Jerusalem's pillars, right? John and Cephas and James, they're the ones who are saying they don't believe in a Christ crucified. This isn't in any of the writings attributed to them. It's not in line with their soteriology. It's not in line with their ideas. Paul needs this. Paul needs the crucifixion of Jesus Christ to get us away from the law, right? To be redeemed from the cursed law by becoming a curse himself. Curses everyone who hangs on a tree. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. Right? So when it comes to Paul's ideas, Paul is the innovator, Paul is the anomaly, Paul is the one who differentiated from Jesus in his original teaching. Jesus' original followers were Jewish Christians. They were upholding the law, they were upholding the fast, they were upholding circumcision, they were upholding all these things. Paul wanted to move away from this. Paul wanted to appease the Gentiles and the Greeks, and then teach them an idea of a crucified Messiah, like a mythological man, God Savior who comes to redeem the humanity and all of these things, right? And I don't think I don't think this has any basis or any backing from the Old Testament. Prophecies, I bring up one prophecy, Psalms 91, verse 10 through 16, right, where it talks about Jesus being, no evil shall befall you, no scourge will come near your tent, for he will give his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you dash your foot against the stone. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample under foot, because he cleaves to me in love. I'll deliver him, I'll rescue him, because he knows my name. When he calls to me, I'll be there for him. I will respond to him. I will rescue him. I will honor him, and I'll show him my salvation. Right? This is God talking about a prophecy. This is a prophecy attributed to Jesus in Matthew chapter 4. Right? And it talks about Jesus being saved, just like how we see in the Quran. So messianic prophecies completely fold on them whenever we bring our own, and all the groups that were claiming messianic prophecies to say that Jesus was ascended into the heavens, right? Like Psalms 2, for example, from the Basilians. But it was a good discussion. Thank you, Lucerna, for having it with me.
All right, Lucerna, go ahead with your 3 minutes, starting now.
Well, he talked really fast. He talked a lot. So it was a lot to digest. I didn't think he talked that fast. And we had a lot of time, and he talks very fast. So there was a lot of information that I didn't get to respond to, or I didn't even memorize, because I was trying to take notes, but he was talking very fast. So on a lot of the stuff that he refuted in the opening statement, I was never going to bring up in the first place. So that's kind of sad. But textual criticism isn't something I specialize in. I came in here because I was kind of interested in it, but maybe we can have another debate about this one day. But what I really liked was the part about the prophecies. Like, I think the prophecies were very interesting. Like what he brought up right now, I presumed he'd bring that up about Psalms 91, so maybe we can have a discussion about the prophecies one day, and the Messianic prophecies concerning if the crucifixion was to happen or not. But it was fruitful. It was a fruitful debate, I guess. I mean, I didn't learn much. I don't think he learned anything new either. Like, he seemed to have heard all these objections before. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the debate. It was nice.
All right, man. Thank you. It was a nice discussion. I think we all had fun. I think we all enjoyed it. I think we all,
Benefited.
you know, benefited from this.
Yeah, thank you for the two debaters and on behalf of the staff of the server. We appreciate your time and thanks for the audience.
I guess that concludes the debates. Yeah. All right. To the Muslims, assalamu alaikum, and to everyone else, have a nice day. All right.
Bro, you're not a muhaddith. Why would I care about you? You're nobody. I have the salaf. Who are you? Bro, wallahi, this muhaddithin, it became too much, bro. On Discord, muhaddithin.
I'll give you the people we can.